on the Joe Rogan Experience. From leaked UFO files, alien encounters as a result of nuclear weapon deployment, Soviet soldiers being turned to stone during a UFO encounter, and even Joe Rogan asking Elon Musk and President Trump about aliens. These are the craziest alien stories ever told on JRE. This brings us to the first clip, where Joe Rogan shares a chilling story with Post Malone about a Russian encounter with aliens that resulted in the deaths of 23 Soviet soldiers. This is a conversation from episode 2018.
There's a famous story from the Soviet Union that these guys shot at a UFO and it turned them into stone.
Is it true?
Joe Rogan begins reading a CIA file based on KGB materials that details the soldiers' contact with the UFO in Siberia.
According to the KGB materials, a quite low-flying spaceship in the shape of a saucer appeared above a military unit that was conducting routine training maneuvers. For unknown reasons, somebody unexpectedly launched a surface-to-air missile and hit the UFO. It fell to Earth not far away, and 5 short humanoids with large heads and large black eyes emerged from it. It is stated in the testimonies by the 2 soldiers who remained alive that after freeing themselves from the debris, the aliens came close together and then merged into a single object that acquired a spherical shape. That object began to buzz and hiss sharply and then became brilliant white. In a few seconds, the spheres grew much bigger and exploded by flaring up with an extremely bright light. At that very instant, 23 soldiers who had watched the phenomenon turned into stone poles. Yeah, only 2 soldiers who stood in the shade and were less exposed to the luminous explosion survived.
For context, the UFO incident is said to have taken place in 1942, and while there is no physical evidence of this particular craft, we can't say for certain that it didn't happen. After all, this wouldn't be the first time the government has hidden extraterrestrial discoveries from the public, and also the complete 250-page file has never been released to the public. Joe Rogan reads the concluding section of the CIA document exploring just how advanced alien technology might actually be, and it raises a critical question: if aliens exist, do we truly stand a chance against them?
The CIA representative stated, if the KGB file corresponds to reality, this is an extremely menacing case. The aliens possess such weapons and technology that go beyond all our assumptions. They can stand up for themselves if attacked. But the thing is, they're saying if the file corresponds to reality, that means there's a question.
If this is real, they're tough.
Yeah, they can fuck with you.
The 2 also discuss the possibility that some of the so-called alien tech discoveries might not be alien at all. Joe wonders if it's just a smokescreen. Could the government be blaming extraterrestrials to cover up their top-secret projects?
I think some of it has to be ours. I think some of it has to be like super advanced drone technology that we don't want everyone knowing about, and it's probably some black ops shit. But I don't think that's all of it. I think it's also possible that we've been visited. It just makes sense. It sounds so stupid. That's part of the problem of even talking about it, because it sounds dumb, because there's no evidence. So you have to believe in something where there's no evidence of it other than like some blurry photographs. But then when you just think about the size of the universe itself and the fact that we exist here on this planet. We're real. We know we're real.
To end this segment, Post talks about how, even without solid evidence, many people still believe in the existence of aliens to some degree.
I don't know. It's so weird, man. I don't know. And you're talking about the oh shit moment. I think we've been so like normalized to it, like E.T., all this shit, growing up watching this shit, to where it's like, yeah, no shit. Everyone, no matter what the surveys say or anything, everyone thinks there's like something going on.
Everyone. Yeah. There's a few people that still are very incredulous. Elon, believe it or not, is incredulous. He's famously said, if the aliens are real, they sure are subtle.
They're very subtle. Bigfoot's subtle too.
Up next, James Fox tells the story of a police officer's encounter with aliens while on patrol in New Mexico in 1964. And what makes it even more shocking is the government's swift attempt to silence the officer. This is a conversation from episode number 1976.
One of the best, most well-documented cases in U.S. history took place at Socorro, New Mexico, April 24th, 1964, at 5 o'clock with a police officer that was on duty by the name of Lonnie Zamora. The best case in U.S. history, the best documented case. The first military officer to arrive on the scene got there. The The bushes were still smoking. I mean, the imprints in the ground of the craft, the footprints, they got diagrams of this stuff.
Take a look at this picture of the site where Officer Lonnie Zamora saw a UFO. James explains how the Air Force went out of its way to silence Lonnie, ensuring he didn't talk about it publicly. And according to James, the experience completely turned Lonnie's life upside down.
Daughter and his wife told me clearly, and his wife said, Lonnie was never the same after that case. But
so what did Lonnie see?
Lonnie saw two beings at the base of an egg-shaped craft that was landed in an arroyo in Socorro, New Mexico in broad daylight. Lonnie looked out the window of his patrol car. He saw something that caught his eye, and then this object landed. He was actually in hot pursuit at the time. He gave up pursuit to go investigate what was going on, and he sees this object in the arroyo in the desert on the ground. It's such a well-documented case. And he rolls down his car window and he's looking out and he's going, am I looking at like an overturned car? What the hell am I looking at? And then he sees two little figures. He said they were childlike at the base of the craft, and one of them locked eyes with him. And his wife said he was never the same after that. But
how did he describe them? What
he said like? They were small, childlike. It's small, and they had white coveralls, tight coveralls. This is a close encounter of the third kind.
To end this segment, James dives deeper into Officer Lonnie Zamora's incredible encounter with the UFO. He describes how the craft looked, the mind-blowing speed at which it moved, and one detail that stood out, a mysterious symbol imprinted on its body.
The object was sitting on the ground, not for very long, just a few minutes. Lonnie saw the beings, and he went like around to get a closer look. I mean, he was like, what the hell am I looking at? And he drove his car around to get a closer look, and he lost contact for a second while he drove around to get a closer look. Now he's within 50 feet of this egg thing sitting on the ground. And he gets out of the patrol car. It starts making some weird noise, and it has a blue flame that comes out. And he said it was not like a rocket flame where it would hit the ground and dust everything up, but it pierced the ground like a knife. It went completely silent with no flame, no nothing. You can hear a pin drop. And there was a symbol on the side of the craft. It was in yellow, and it was about 3 feet tall, and it was like a V like this, 2 lines and a line on top.
Take a look at the image of the symbol Officer Lonnie saw on the side of the craft, and here's an illustration of what the aliens may have looked like from Officer Lonnie's point of view. Next, Joe Rogan and David Grush discuss the concept that aliens may have created humans. They explore the topic of genetic manipulation and the seeding of life on Earth by extraterrestrial beings. This is a conversation from episode number 2065.
Is the aliens chat?
Things that we're experiencing are the natural progression of what happens when you do seed life on planet, or you do accelerate biological life. You do have some sort of a genetic intervention where you take this thing that it has emerging intelligence and you accelerate it. And that thing will in turn, with all of its desire for innovation and creativity, and also all of its desire to control resources and have power and have influence, that it will eventually lead to the creation of what we're seeing. That these things are the next stage of this process. Yeah. And that maybe we're dealing with one form of that next stage, but there's another stage that's a million years more advanced than that, that's far superior, that doesn't even have a biological limitation in terms of physical space, that it exists completely in some other undetectable realm.
While Joe doesn't explicitly mention aliens in this specific context, his suggestion of a deliberate act of seeding life or genetic intervention could imply the involvement of a more advanced civilization, possibly alien in nature. However, it's important to note that Joe doesn't provide concrete evidence for this theory. It remains speculative and open to interpretation. As the conversation progressed, Joe addressed the skepticism surrounding advanced extraterrestrial beings crashing their spacecraft. He offers a couple of theories to explain why this could be happening.
I always wonder, when there's a crash or when there's a body or when there's a this and that, like, and people saying, well, why, if they're so advanced, why are they crashing? Well,
I'm going to get some Christmas pie.
saying there's one thing that's visiting us. If there's one thing that's visiting us and we know where this one thing is, we could say, oh, well, that thing, it deals with a completely different solar system that's not as vulnerable. It doesn't have asteroid clouds. It doesn't have all these different things where it's like, it doesn't have a planet that has super volcanoes. Maybe life evolved in a more stable environment and it allowed it to get to a far greater technological level, but not the ultimate.
Yeah, we might be testing the extent of their adaptability. And like I said, are they crashing by accident?
Right.
Mission failure? Or on purpose?
Joe makes it clear to Grush how little we know about the universe. He highlights the vastness of the universe compared to human life. He also discusses the James Webb Space Telescope's recent discoveries, which have raised questions about the universe's age and timeline.
How about the Big Bang itself? Like,
Yeah.
What happened? Something smaller than the head of a pin? For no known reason becomes everything?
Yeah.
Okay.
And what's the universe expanding into?
Right.
It's like a quantum foam or whatever the heck the latest theory is that's like beyond me.
And then it perhaps
yeah.
just retracts back down to that infinitely small thing and then expands again.
Yeah.
And that this is an endless cycle and that we're just so limited because of our biological limitations. Our life and death is such a small little tiny blip. It's so minuscule in terms of just the overall known life of the universe. And then you have the James Webb Telescope that's, there's people that question the actual length of time that occurred between the Big Bang and now, that maybe it might be far longer. And there's people like Brian Keating that say that's not correct. It's just a lack of understanding of what we understand currently about the creation of galaxies.
Up next, Joe Rogan sits with Bob Lazar and Jeremy Corbell to discuss leaked UFO files. Lazar also reveals how the government, notorious for its leaks, has to outsource the security of certain top-secret projects to private companies. This is a conversation from episode number 1315.
So there was a document that is circulating right now that is really big. It's going around everywhere. People are asking and
What
wondering.
is this document?
It's called the Wilson Memo, is how you can find it online. So Admiral Wilson meets with this scientist and they have this discussion, oddly enough, at special projects at EG&G. And if I remember, the document is from 2001. I'm telling everybody right now, it's real. And we'll see, my history is pretty good with saying if something's real or not, right? So here we go. The document comes out. They meet at EG&G Special Projects. In 1989, they stumble into a problem. This happens, they put the technology away, and then they bring it back out and see if material science has caught up and if they can make any progress. So this document kind of talks about this process.
For context, the Wilson leak, also known as the Admiral Wilson Memo, is a controversial document that allegedly details a conversation between Dr. Eric Davis, an astrophysicist associated with advanced aerospace research, and Admiral Thomas Wilson, a retired US Navy officer. The document surfaced online in 2019 and has become a centerpiece for UFO researchers and enthusiasts.
It said in that document specifically.
It's between a scientist and an admiral that are sitting and they're having a meeting and they're talking about the search for the UFO subject, the search to get special access program access to all of these different things like reverse engineering programs. So in this document, they talk about it. I believe that this document, the person that went was employed by Robert Bigelow, one of the guys that has a couple orbiting satellites and all that stuff.
He's the guy who owns Skinwalker Ranch.
No, he's not.
No?
He was the guy that owns
He used to
Skinwalker.
own it. Okay.
Yeah, he used to own it. There's a new owner, and I interviewed him for my other film. Anyway, the whole point of this insertion here is just that document kind of validates a lot of this idea Bob just said, that they make a little progress, then they can't go anywhere. They tuck it away, and then they bring it back out, 10 years later and start working on it. What is the limiting factor? I think Bob should speak on this, but it's the materials.
Joe questions whether, in the meantime, there are people who fully understand what's going on behind the scenes, and Lazar confirms it. Lazar further explains how the government keeps many of its top-secret projects under wraps by outsourcing the security and control to private companies, and this was confirmed by the leaked document.
But I think what George uncovered is probably accurate, that we try and do what we can, and once we reach a roadblock on we really can't figure it out, it's just friggin' put the thing away, wait for science to catch up, and a decade later, let's take the project out again and see, all right, now where can we go?
But there's got to be someone who remains informed, right?
Oh, yeah.
So you've got your scientists like you and Barry. You got your people that you compartmentalize. You got these people working on this
there
project.
has to be some people that know everything.
You've got security, and then someone's going to be on the outside saying, hey, we need people to guard this building. Don't let anybody in for 10 years.
I think a lot of that is private industry, and I think that's how they keep it. Yeah, I think that's how they because the government is just so leaky. I think that's kind of what they're doing.
That's what the document kind of proves. You just articulated that it is in control of private industry.
What private industry?
Christmas pie.
Some aerospace company, something?
I don't know.
Yeah, the admiral wouldn't name it in the car, in the conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Up next, James Fox sits down with Joe Rogan to discuss the 1996 alien sighting in Brazil. The story centers on 3 girls who claim to have communicated with a wounded alien, only to face efforts by the country's military to silence them. This is a conversation from episode number 1976.
Is there any conventional explanation why the military shut everything down? Why they had military barricades set up around that area?
No, they did try to say that the creature was this guy who's got like some deformities, but I've seen the guy Modine or something like that. But you talk to the witnesses.
But why would the military shut the town down because a guy with deformities?
And then for the doctors in the hospital, they said, there was like a midget having a baby or something weird, just something that was just so ridiculous. It was like, and you talk to the witnesses and they're just like, oh, come on, I'm not even gonna, that's laughable at best.
For context, in 1996, an extraordinary event occurred in the small town of Varginha, Brazil. Known as the Brazilian Roswell, it became famous for claims of an alien encounter. Several people said they saw strange things, including 3 young girls who reported seeing a mysterious creature. The story quickly spread around the world and became one of the most talked about UFO cases ever. But the government didn't want this story to gain too much attention. So, the military stepped in, took the alien's body, and started spreading cover-up stories, just as James mentioned earlier.
I mean, these girls came within 8 to 10 feet. Three women. Katya, 2 sisters, Liliani and Valkyria, 14, 16, and 21. They got within 8 to 10 feet in broad daylight of this creature. And one of the things that doesn't come across in the film, when they saw this thing, they're looking like, what are we looking at here? They're walking through this field and it's up against a cinder block wall. And one of them was looking at it, what is that? And it was crouched by the wall. It was weak and feeble. And one of them kind of like screeched, like, what is that? And it turned and it looked right at the girls, locked eyes on them. Liliana grabs her younger sister, who's 14, Valkyria, and hightails it out of there. Katya is 21. She's frozen in her tracks, locked eyes with this creature, and it's communicating with her. Please help me. He wants help. It's weak and it's feeble and it's scared, and it's crouched down. Liliani realizes that Katya is back there. She gets, 100 feet down the path. She leaves her sister, stay here, I'm going back to get Katya. She runs back. And
y'all believe this chat?
Katya, and I asked all the girls, during that moment of contact, when you lock eyes, I know it's only a brief second, but during that moment of contact, what did you feel? Like, put me there. That's where the title comes from, Moment of Contact, because that was when they locked eyes on this creature. And that's when Katya said, help me, I'm scared. And it was feeble and suffering. And it's a very powerful moment.
While interviewing the 3 children and the mother exposed that suspicious men in suits had offered a suitcase full of $100 bills to relocate. Another bizarre thing James was told was the smell that was emitted from this creature. He begins to describe to Joe what the witnesses said about the smell.
And it's in the movie. You can hear the mother talking about it, and she's so emotional. And the mother came back to the location where it happened. The smell, that stench, and the footprint on the ground. I mean, everybody talks about that stench, that it was so... They said, if you ever take like a skunk, multiply that by like 100,000, that would give you some indication of the level of like how putrid and nasty. It was paralyzing. And it stayed in the areas, like at the hospitals when they did the x-rays, and everybody talks about it. That stench, though, it's just unbelievable. Like, it fills your navel cavities and doesn't leave.
You guys think aliens would talk to us?
Same thing.
And they couldn't get it out.
They couldn't get it out. Yeah, they sanitized the hospital. The guy said that he had to close off that wing of the hospital while they were sanitizing it because it was so intense. So
How long did it last for?
I heard days and weeks is what I heard from people. And even the mother said when she went to where the creature was, she said that the stench, even there, after the creature was gone, got in her nasal cavities, and she tried to flush it out with water and saline or whatever, and she just couldn't get it out of her nasal cavities. Really crazy. But they all did. I mean, everybody talked about that stench, you know?
James goes on to share the story of his interaction with the military officer who transported the alien from the scene.
The military officer, the guy that drove the creature around, I was sitting across from him. You can't see his face, but I did. And I'm looking this guy in the eyes. I'm thinking, I could be looking at a guy that drove a fucking alien around. You have no idea, dude. You have no idea.
How did he describe it?
So fucking intense. When I came back from that trip, people were like, how was your trip to Brazil? What was it like, man? They got great, smoothies and coffee, and I'm just like, you guys have no idea. I think an alien spaceship crashed, and they recovered live aliens, and we made contact, and the Americans came in. That's what I'm thinking about.
James also talks about his interview with the doctor who worked on the X-rays of the alien. He had spent a long time trying to get the doctor to talk, and when it finally happened, it was worth it. Hearing the story straight from someone who was involved gave James more insight into the days and made the mystery feel even more real.
Think about the doctor who took the X-rays of this thing. Marco Leal, thank you, Marco. You're the man. Marco Leal found him 8 years ago, and he was like, he confirmed the story. He was still working at Regional Hospital. He goes, I'll never come forward. Marco kept going every year back and forth. Then he retired, and 4 years after he retired, he agreed to meet with us. He wasn't even sure he was going to go on. And I said, look, man, we'll film you from the back. We'll disguise your voice. Showed us photographs of him at the hospital. We know we've been trying to get at him. Excuse me. At the end of the interview, he said, thank you. I feel so much better. I've been shouldering that burden for 26 years.
Joe asks James to give a full breakdown of the doctor's testimony about the alien encounter. Apparently, the soldiers were so secretive of the operation that even after the doctor performed the X-ray on the alien, he was refused access to the results of the tests.
When you talked to the doctor, what did he describe?
He said that it was a normal day, January 1996, it was a regional hospital. He said every day, and all of a sudden, all these military trucks and police cars showed up at the hospital. They come in armed, and they got a bag. They got a thing in a black body bag. And he was like, what the hell's going on here? They're like, you're going to be taking some X-rays. And he's like, okay. And they had him inside, and they had armed scrubs. And I was asking him, like, what was it like? Because when I interview witnesses, I always ask them to project. Sometimes I'll even close my eyes because I'll use their words to recreate. So I'm like living it through them. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I'll close my eyes and I'll recreate the scenes in my head with their words, right? It's harder in Portuguese because I'm having to get it translated. But I ask questions like, what was the atmosphere like? Was there any talking? No talking. Super tense atmosphere. Very tense. Armed guards on the outside, armed guards on the inside, military trucks running. Nobody comes, nobody goes. And he said, first time in the history of my career, I took the X-rays and I couldn't even verify that they were good because they took them immediately. And then they said this event never happened. He said the stench in the hotel, in the hospital was overwhelming. And he goes through the different X-rays that he took: the abdomen, the head, the arms, the legs, the thorax, And it was incredible.
In the final parts of the conversation, James reveals where the soldier that moved the body of the alien first transported it to, how the United States became involved in the operation, and ultimately how their involvement led to the case going cold.
That when he drove it from Humanitas Hospital, it's in the movie, but he drove it from Humanitas Hospital to as a military base where it spent the night in the truck for one night, and then it went from there to Espesex Campinas. It's like a university. It's where all the intellectual scientific heavyweights reside. And then it was there, I think, under examination, according to the witnesses that we talked to, for a day or two, and that's when the Americans flew in to Campinas. And we have the radar military control officer who came forward last year, actually 2 years ago, when we were there filming for the last time. His name is Marco Feres, F-E-R-E-S, and he came forward for the first time and he said, yeah, in January of 1996, this plane came in, USAF, he kept calling it, United States Air Force, came in, it didn't have the authorization of the Brazilian government. He was like, this thing can't land. And some higher up stepped into the room. This is his testimony. I'm just relaying what he said. He said some higher up came in the room and said, let it land. And it came and it landed at Campinas. And then from Campinas, 2 helicopters, according to him, flew to Varginha, Brazil, Varginha back to Campinas. Then they loaded something on the airplane and then off to the United States. And that's where the case goes cold.
Up next, Joe Rogan gets Trump to discuss UFO.
Was something, and it was going 4 times faster than an F-22, which is a very fast plane, and it was round.
Trump openly discusses his skepticism about the existence of aliens. The two also discuss recent theories suggesting that many of the so-called UFO sightings might not be extraterrestrial at all. They could actually be Chinese drones.
The
It's
universe
not
is
been a
pretty
big
vast.
thing for me. I mean, when I looked at what China did to this, they would have never done it with me, where they put the balloon up, and a lot of people thought for a little while that was
Right.
one of these things. So,
Well, that's a lot of the speculation too, that some of these drones that
Could
hover
be.
over battleships, that these are Chinese drones, and that they're not
could be.
UFOs.
They
They're-
could be also.
Up next, James Fox and Joe Rogan discuss fascinating theories surrounding alien visits to Earth. They explore the idea that extraterrestrial sightings became more frequent after humans began using nuclear weapons. This is a conversation from episode number 1976.
Am I correct in, this is one of the things that I've always heard, is that after the bombs were dropped,
Yes.
that's when the UFO started showing up.
Well, that's when the activity certainly heightened. And so
Is
let's
there
go-
any indication that they were directly connected, other than the fact that they just show up?
For context, the first nuclear bomb used in warfare was dropped on August 6, 1945, when the United States dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima, Japan during World War II. Before that moment, UFO sightings were rare, but after 1945, reports of alien sightings started pouring in. Many of these reports are ones we'll go through in this video. Joe and James can't help but wonder if the use of nuclear weapons might have triggered the frequent visit from aliens. James also shares a story about how he came to this conclusion.
I'll tell you how it organically came upon my attention. I was working with this guy, Lance Mungia. He was one of the editors that was working on the phenomenon with me. And we were doing this archive from this guy named David Marler's got this incredible archive of UFO material dating right back to the 40s, all the way to modern day. Newspaper headlines, audio recordings, statements, broadcast, unbelievable. The biggest archive you could spend the rest of your life in there. So he gave me a bunch of stuff that was archive interviews of primarily people at White Sands, Holloman Air Force Base, different areas in Texas. And I was just putting it in. It's kind of like a little montage in the piece of just giving the illustration that these things are going on kind of all over. And my buddy goes, hey, man, let's put a map on the wall and put pins in the map for all these different locations. So I was like, oh, okay, sure, let's do that. So we put a map on the wall in the edit room when we were doing the phenomenon. And we were putting pins in, and we looked at each other after like a day or two. We were like, look at proximity to Trinity Site. Wow. Even Socorro, White Sands, this place in Texas. Like, that's kind of unusual. We're kind of scratching our heads. Do you think there's a correlation?
For context, James and Lance noticed something strange while digging through the archives. Many of the recent alien sightings they reviewed happened near the Trinity site. Trinity is the code name for the first ever nuclear weapon test, conducted on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert. Less than a month later, it was used to bomb Hiroshima. Do you see how this all adds up? The US starts to use nuclear weapons, and suddenly aliens start to show up more often. James goes on to describe his meeting with the late Senator, Harry Reid. He explains how this conversation reinforced his theory.
And then I met with Senator Harry Reid. Thank you, George Knapp, for helping make that happen. Former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, who started the ATIP program. And during the interview, I didn't think about asking him this, but at the end, and he had like, I'll have 47 minutes with you, and then I got to go. And he's got all the security guards and big guys with earpieces looking at me. And I said, well, sir, would you mind if we could do a quick walk and talk? He goes, yeah, I'll give you 45 seconds. So I figured, well, while I'm walking with Senator Reid, I'm going to ask him what was one of the more astonishing aspects of the phenomenon that they uncovered during this Pentagon UFO program. And right away, without hesitation, he goes, the fact that there are incursions over our nuclear missile facilities, nuclear armed facilities, that is of grave concern. That was a shocking aspect of the phenomenon. And I thought back to that map that we'd done in the edit room.
Speaking of incursions at nuclear facilities, in 1967, multiple witnesses at Malmstrom Air Force Base reported UFOs hovering over the nuclear facility, and during the event, 10 nuclear missiles suddenly became non-operational, and to this day, there has been no clear explanation as to how this happened. In 1968, at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, a personnel observed a UFO near the base with reports of strange behaviors in missile systems and radar interference.
I contacted this guy named Robert Hastings, who's the guy who wrote the book on the connection between UFOs and nukes.
What is the book?
His name is Robert Hastings, UFOs and Nukes, I think. But in any case, I contacted him, and he's like, oh, I'm not doing too well. I got this heart condition. I tell you what, you can have all my archives, all the videos that I shot. So I went through all of it, and I put together just like a 5 or 10 minute segment in the phenomenon, that connection. And you got all these like missile control launch officers and people at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Minot Air Force Base, talking about these incredible incursions. And keep in mind, you're talking about people that we entrusted with the securement and deployment of nuclear weapons, okay? So if these guys are lying, that's a problem. And if these guys are hallucinating when they've got nuclear weapons at their disposal, that's terrifying. And it's happening all over. I mean, I've got at least 15 or 20 of these guys testifying.
To end this segment, James reveals that all the individuals who witnessed these nuclear facility incursions are now testifying directly to Sean Kirkpatrick, the director of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO.
I interviewed this guy, Robert Salas. Robert Salas was Lieutenant Robert Salas, Launch Control Officer, United States Air Force, has this incredible encounter in Malmstrom. His people do, and UFO sighted a disc, and then his nuke starts shutting down. He said to me, I'll never forget this, and this is like 2002, this is part of Out of the Blue. He goes, well, James, very calm. You could see why he was a launch control officer, very measured. Everything that came out of his mouth was calm and measured. He goes, well, James, the way I see it, it's kind of like taking matches out of the hands of a baby.
Whoa.
Yeah, whoa, right?
Well, that makes sense.
So there's a preponderance of testimony from these guys, and they're testifying right now to Arrow, Sean Kirkpatrick.
Up next, Joe is met with an interesting story from Bob Lazar about his experience in a UFO back when he worked at Area 51. This is a conversation from episode number 1315.
So take me back to first day on the job. You accept a job. They take you out there.
Yeah, it's the first day really, I didn't really get to see a whole lot. The first day was essentially just paperwork. That's when I flew into Area 51 proper. And I left McCarran Airport and flew what they call the Janet flights. Just, a passenger plane from Las Vegas to Area 51. And it was really just going through a mountain of paperwork that day, from security clearances to... it was like 2 or 3 hours of just solid paperwork. And that was really an uneventful first day.
In 1984, Bob Lazar was trying to make his way back into the scientific world. So he started sending out resumes. One of them landed in the hands of Ed Teller, the renowned physicist and chemical engineer. Teller decided to give Bob a reference to EG&G, a defense contractor heavily involved in weapons research and development during the Cold War. After a few interviews, Bob finally got a job offer, but he was given almost zero details about the job. He was simply told he was going to work on some test sites. It wasn't until he arrived at the site that he realized that he had just gotten hired to work at Area 51.
When did you realize, like at what point in time did you say, hey, this is not normal work? Like, this doesn't even seem like it's from this planet.
That, I can't tell you what day that occurred on because so much time has gone by, the days have kind of fused into one, and I can't separate the days.
Was it a slow burn, or was there a moment of recognition?
Well, the first inkling I had was when I came in. There's this facility that is at S4. It's in the side of a mountain, and normally we had pulled in with the bus and gone around the front through a normal double door. This time that I went in, there were hangar doors open. I went in through the hangar door, and in the hangar door was the disc, the flying saucer that I worked on. I saw it sitting there, and we walked by it. It had a little American flag stuck on the side, and I thought, oh my God, this finally explains all the flying saucer stories. This is just an advanced fighter, and this is fucking hilarious.
Bob recalls meeting his lab partner, who didn't hold back on sharing the strange and secretive things happening at the test site. But what was mind-blowing for Bob was a reactor he saw that seemed straight out of another world.
So that was the first time I had seen anything that was weird. It was some time later that I was introduced to my lab partner, Barry, and we had some of the subcomponents of the craft in the lab, and Barry was very anxious to get a new lab partner. So he was very talkative and couldn't wait to show me different things. And it was in the demonstration of the reactor working where it caught my attention to where this is technology that doesn't even exist. So, I mean, that was the first time I knew that this is really something different.
Joe presses Bob for a straight answer, wanting a clear and detailed description of exactly what Bob saw. Over the years, Bob has been surrounded by controversies, including accusations of fabricating stories, conflicting accounts about his experiences, and a reputation as a conspiracy theorist. Joe's goal was simple: cut through the chaos and ensure the audience had a crystal clear understanding of Bob's claim.
What was it? What was it about this reactor that made you think that it didn't exist technologically?
Well, it was I actually have to back up because there were some briefings that I read it before that, certainly gave me the impression that this was going to be a weird job, but this was the first hands-on thing. This was a small reactor about the size of a hemisphere, about the size of a basketball, on a metal plate, and when it was running, it produced a gravitational field of its own. Now, this is something that we can't do. We can't produce any gravity. The only way we get gravity is from large quantities of mass, but there's no machine we can have that turns on that makes gravity. Like, you can turn on an electromagnet and it makes a magnetic field. We can't make a gravitational field. Anyway, this device was producing that, and Barry said, almost like he was bragging, go ahead, try and touch the sphere, and I couldn't. It pushed my hands away, just like two like poles of a magnet. So that was...
so like when you take two magnets and you try to press them together and they push
you have
against
that,
each other?
Yeah, that kind of cushion feeling, but you can't get them together. The closer you put them, the more they push.
For Bob, this experience lined up perfectly with everything he had read during the briefing on the first day of the job. The mission for the project was to reverse engineer the alien craft and figure out how to replicate its technology using materials we have here on Earth. According to Bob, there were multiple alien crafts being worked on, and he says he got the chance to look inside one of them.
I did get a chance to look inside the craft on only one occasion, and this was important because where the reactor sat might have been critical to how it operated, since everything operates without any interconnection, so the placement of components might be critical. So they allowed me to go inside and look at it.
So you're going into this craft, and what are you thinking when you're inside of it? Like, what are you seeing?
It's a very ominous feeling because first of all, everything is one color. It's like a dark pewter color, and there are no right angles anywhere. It's as if somebody took, I've said this before, somebody took a model and fashioned it out of wax and then heated it just for a short time so everything melted. Everything looks like it's fused together. Everything has a radius of curvature where two items meet. It's a really weird looking thing.
Bob describes his experience stepping into a UFO. He tells Joe every detail, from its massive size to its otherworldly design. He vividly recalls the moment, describing how surreal it felt to stand inside an alien spacecraft clearly designed for beings half his size.
So you get inside this thing, and it's designed for something that's much smaller than a human being.
Yeah, you can't really stand up till you get to the very center of it.
And how tall are you?
I'm 5'10".
And what do you think this was designed for?
I'd say something close to half my height.
Wow. So these little 3-foot tallish creatures.
Yeah, and the seats were small too. I mean, obviously it was made, for something small. But there was no, there's nothing else in there. There's just seats, the reactor, and some of the subcomponents. There's no control panels. There's no bathroom. There's no decorative components or artwork or anything that you would recognize or trim. I mean, it's just a very bare bones thing.
You're not seeing any screens?
Well, there are archways around it that are part of the superstructure, and one of the archways can become transparent. When I was in there, there was another group working on one of the archways, and you could call that a screen, more or less.
So through that archway, it would maintain the solidity, the solid, whatever metal it was.
Yeah.
But you could see through it.
Yeah, it just became transparent. Yeah. I saw that happen once or twice before I left.
Lazar describes the tests they ran on the UFOs, detailing how the craft completely defied some of the laws of physics as we understand them. Watching these tests in action shook some of his core beliefs about how the universe works.
But what did you do while you were there? If you're looking at this object, this reactor, and you can't figure out what it is or how it works, other than the fact that it works on this element that we don't even know about.
Well, sure. I mean, the thing was what you do in, with anything. If you're trying to analyze it, all you can do is perform tests. And all we did is try and come up with every kind of test we possibly could. I mean, we tested, it violated a lot of what we thought was impossible to violate. I mean, one of the first laws of thermodynamics, I mean, essentially, any machine, any device that operates always makes extra heat. Nothing works at 100% efficient. Even the headphones you're wearing, anything that takes power, some of that power is going to be converted to heat, and it's just wasted. This didn't. I mean, we looked at, back then we had infrared cameras. They're different today, but back then you had to pour liquid nitrogen into the camera to cool the sensor down and get these infrared images you've seen. But it never got, no matter what the load was on the reactor, it never got above the ambient temperature, which is impossible. I mean, you're, pulling out huge amounts of power and nothing ever gets warm.
To end this segment, Lazar shares with Joe how the government was conducting test flights with the alien crafts. Keep in mind, these UFOs have no steering wheels or control panels. Naturally, Joe couldn't help but ask how they were able to fly them.
Did you know at all how they were piloting it? Because they were doing some tests where they were having these things fly around in the sky. And this is what gets us deeper into your story.
Right. I was out there for one test. Right. In fact, I was with Barry in the lab, and Dennis came in and said, we're about to run a test. Why don't you guys come out? Or I think he said, Barry, why don't you come out here and bring Bob with you? We went out there, and the craft was already outside the hangar and was just preparing to lift off. Now, they were in communication with somebody in the craft.
So there was a person in the craft?
Yeah, there was certainly a person in there. Now, it's not a comfortable place to be in because it's small, so the guy has to be sitting on the floor in the middle, my best guess.
And this is the same specific craft that you worked on? Because that was the only craft that you were in.
The only one that I touched and worked on. It quietly lifted off the ground, which was incredibly impressive to see.
Quietly or silently?
Well, quietly, because it
Did it make some sort of a noise?
It produced a little corona discharge from the bottom. A corona discharge is kind of a high voltage brush, little bluish glow discharge. As it was lifting off the ground, you can hear a slight hiss sound. Now, as soon as it cleared the ground by about 5 or 10 feet, maybe even less than that, the hissing stopped and the blue glow disappeared. So it lifted off quietly and then it hovered silently, if you want to be specific.
Up next, Joe Rogan dives into Bob Lazar's controversial story with filmmaker James Fox. Together, they unpack the details, debating whether or not Lazar's claims hold any weight. This is a conversation from episode 1976.
But I mean, you got one person's account, and it's fascinating. And I believe that Lazar believes what he's saying. But I've talked to George Knapp about this, and George said the same thing. I said, maybe, I mean, just maybe. And I'm not out here attacking Lazar or nobody else. I'm just saying maybe he was used as a disinformation plant that seeds some real information and some bogus information, just to kind of test the waters and the reaction of the public. I don't know.
Most certainly that's possible.
Yeah, I really...
Most certainly that's possible.
It's not my domain.
It's also, I would imagine, if you're going to give people access to classified information like that, you'd be very careful, and you would probably add in some stuff that's not true.
Yes.
So it doesn't matter whether or not, as long as like they have a bunch of stuff that's absolutely provable nonsense.
Yes.
On top of the stuff that's
Yes.
probably real, then they get discredited.
Joe makes a good point. The government is known to cleverly protect top secrets information by feeding each scientist a slightly different version of the same story. Sometimes it's the truth, but with a carefully placed lie in between. That way, if the information ever gets leaked, they can easily trace the source.
Look, there's a lot of weird stuff about the Bob Lazar story. A lot of weird stuff about it. And the one that sticks in my mind, and I know this probably shouldn't because it's possible to do, is that it's been consistent. His story's been absolutely consistent since the late 1980s. Now that's possible to develop a narrative, and if you're disciplined, and he's obviously very intelligent, you could just like craft the longest con the world has ever known and make no money from it and turn your life upside down and have the feds search your property, which they did.
Doesn't make a lot of sense.
Video. It doesn't make a lot of sense. If they thought that he really was in possession of element 115 and that there really is a stable version of this element that we discovered in a particle collider, or we accurately, they predicted it and then proved it to be real in a particle collider. But that wasn't until like the 2000s.
Up next, Joe Rogan and Theo Von dive into a lighthearted conversation about the possibility of billionaires being aliens. The ultra-wealthy seem to operate on a completely different level, working endlessly without much need for rest or sleep. It's a playful exchange that might make you rethink what makes someone truly human. This is a conversation from episode number 1847.
Dude, isn't it weird how guys, like if you look at some of these guys like Elon Musk, Facebook, what's his name, Mark
Zuckerberg.
Yeah, and then the other guy, they look like aliens, bro. Their body's white. They're really...
It's because they work all day.
Right,
like
but
if you look at Elon when he was out on that yacht, those photos they took of him,
yeah.
that motherfucker looks like he hasn't seen the sunlight in years.
Yeah.
Years. Like his body has not been exposed to sun. Like you can't fake that. That whiteness, that's a wild whiteness.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's almost an extraterrestrial whiteness. It's the whiteness you see when you see an alien.
It's paper.
Just look at the image of Elon's pale skin on the yacht. It really makes you wonder when he last spent any time in the sun. The two then discuss how billionaires seem almost alien in their ability to detach from emotions. Joe points out how these high net worth individuals juggle multiple massive projects at once, something that feels superhuman. Take Elon for example. He built Tesla, Neuralink and SpaceX simultaneously. Joe even jokes that you'd have to be an alien to pull off something like that all at once. Or what do you think?
A lot of autism, you see these guys who will do the calculations and they'll be able to, you know, figure things out. They're almost a little bit more of a computer than a person, or they're somewhere in the middle, kind of.
Like they're more advanced than us.
Yeah.
They're eliminating the emotions that hold people back.
That's what they're doing.
Yeah.
And so when you get that, and you get some of these guys that are like that, I think that's kind of the next evolution, and that's closer really to aliens, man.
Yeah.
When you see aliens, they're not like, oh, fuck, man.
Right.
Been a long day.
Scratching their balls. Yeah. That's an interesting thing that I've thought
doing
of
business,
too,
man.
is that maybe that's like the next level of evolution, is that like there's more of a separation between emotional anxiety and all the things, and instead concentrating on calculations and numbers and accomplishments. I mean, just think about all the different things that Elon does simultaneously. That's what's wild. Like, that doesn't seem like a normal human being would have the capacity to develop rockets while he's developing electric cars, while he's developing Neuralink, which is like a human computer brain interface, while he's developing the Boring Company, where he's trying to solve traffic problems.
Speaking of Elon being an alien, here's the ironic twist. The billionaire doesn't even believe they exist. Up next, Joe and Elon dive into theories about why aliens likely aren't real. Elon believes there is no solid photographic evidence, and he makes some other compelling arguments to back up his disbelief. This is a conversation from episode number 1609.
You say the great filter. What did you mean by that?
Well, so there's something called like the Fermi paradox of like, where are the aliens?
Yeah.
So, yeah, where are the aliens? I think it was Carl Sagan that said, like, if there either are a lot of aliens or none, and they're equally terrifying.
Elon makes a strong case, pointing out that if aliens are real, there should be at least one clear, undeniable photo as proof. The two also discuss how ridiculously easy it is to manipulate images in today's digital age.
And I want to be clear, like, to the best of my knowledge, there is no evidence for alien life on Earth. There's no evidence for alien life. There's no direct evidence for alien life. No, and if somebody says, oh, what about this alien for, sighting or whatever, I'm like, listen, it's got to be at least as good as a 7-Eleven or ATM cam, okay? It's like, if somebody's got at least like an iPhone 1 level camera, like something,
The problem with that is it's just too easy to fake things today, too.
Yeah, sure. They should at least try hard in faking.
With AI and advanced editing tools, it's nearly impossible to tell what's real and what's fake anymore. I mean, just look at this supposed image of an alien UFO. Are you convinced? In response to Elon's skepticism, Joe brings up a story about a military commander's encounter with a UFO, showcasing its advanced technological capabilities. But even with that, Elon remained completely unimpressed.
You familiar with Commander David Fravor's account of the Tic Tac UFO that he encountered off of the coast of San Diego? Lex Friedman?
Yeah.
Lex Friedman interviewed him on his podcast, and I interviewed him as well. And if you ever get a chance to listen to Lex's conversation with him, it's really excellent. But this guy is a naval fighter pilot, and he talked about this thing that they tracked on radar that went from more than 60,000 feet above sea level to 1 foot in less than a second. Shaped like a Tic Tac, no visible sign of propulsion, blocked radar, actively jammed their tracking systems, and then went to their predetermined point that they were supposed to, that the fighter jet was supposed to scramble to, went to it 30 miles away in, a couple seconds. Like, they have no idea how it did it. They don't know what it is.
Okay.
And these guys that were working for the Navy off the coast said they had encountered them several times. They didn't know what they were. They didn't know what to do.
Well, do they have
they
a
just did
photo
nothing.
or something? I mean,
They do. They have video of it.
Okay.
They have video of it. They have, there's, you ever see the New York Times article that came out in 2017 about this stuff?
I don't know.
The conversation shifts as Joe poses a very interesting question. If aliens exist, would they even want to reveal themselves to us? Elon responds with a sarcastic remark. Joe pushed the question further, asking Elon how often he thinks about aliens as he prepares to take humanity to Mars. But Joe is shocked by Elon's response.
Do you think that they would want us to know? Or do you think they would just be observing and making sure we don't blow ourselves up? Would
I don't know,
if you
man.
were an
They're
alien
real
civilization?
They sure are subtle. I mean, if they wanted us to know, obviously they could just,
for sure,
show up and walk down Main Street,
Right.
like, hey, I'm an alien, check me out,
Right.
Here's my spaceship, I just land in the middle of Times Square. I'll be like,
Right.
Okay.
Or hover over downtown LA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were like, okay, we believe you.
Yeah.
So whatever they are very subtle, these aliens.
How often do you think about it?
Zero.
Zero? Even though you're thinking about interplanetary travel, you don't really think about aliens.
No, I mean, if they show up, I'm like, great, okay, now this is new information. But we... well,
What an interesting way of putting it. This is new information.
This is new information. Like, where were you guys up till now?
To end this segment, Elon demands concrete evidence of extraterrestrial life. He argues that while archaeologists have uncovered many ancient artifacts, none of them point to advanced technology that humans couldn't have achieved at that time.
I mean, we have archaeologists going all over the world looking at things. Where there's this people... Like, if we were to find something like, let's say, like a cube of titanium, just like a 1-inch cube of titanium, say, in the middle of the pyramid, I'd be like, aliens for sure. There's no way they could have made titanium back then. There's no way. That's hard. That's all. One little, didn't even need a computer. Like, a computer would be like, hey, wow, computers, they didn't have computers back then, so it must be aliens. But even just like some advanced metallurgy, anything, like, we would say anything like that.
Right. Nothing like that that we could point to that we can't do.
Everything that we found archaeologically is consistent with the time, the technology they had at that time.
Archaeologically.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're just talking about old stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, just throughout history. It's not like...
Yeah.
Like if aliens visited, there'd be something buried somewhere, you'd think. We haven't seen anything. So, anyway, I mean, maybe there are aliens, but they're very subtle. If there are, they're just very, they're being pretty shy.
Up next, Joe Rogan and physicist Michio Kaku discuss the recent change in how UFO sightings are evaluated and perceived. Michio believes that the burden of proof has shifted. In the past, it used to fall on UFO believers to prove what they saw was real, but now the responsibility is on institutions like the Pentagon and the military to prove that these sightings are not extraterrestrial. This is a conversation from episode number 1828.
Right. See, it used to be that one person would see something in the sky and say, look, Martha, look, there's something up there. Now things have changed. Now we have multiple sightings by multiple modes. That is the gold standard. The gold standard for looking for these objects. Not just one person, but several people that are reputable. Not just radar, but visual sighting, infrared sensors, telescopic evidence. Now we have multiple sightings by multiple modes. And so the burden of proof has shifted. It used to be the burden of proof was on the people who believed in UFOs. They saw something, prove it. Now the burden of proof has shifted to the Pentagon, to the military. Now they have to prove that these aren't extraterrestrial. And so I think there's been a sea change in the last just several years.
Michio emphasizes the dramatic shift in how UFOs are perceived and studied over the past 50 years. UFOs are now analyzed as potential military threats due to their advanced technological abilities.
50 years ago, there was a congressional hearing, and it was coming out of Project Blue Book. And there was a lot of laughter and a lot of jokes about little green men in outer space. 50 years ago, that's the way it was. Now, things have changed. Now people are looking at are they a threat militarily? What kinds of sensors do we have? What kind of metrics do we have? We now have frame by frame an analysis of these objects. These objects travel between Mach 5 and Mach 20. That's 20 times the speed of sound. These objects can zigzag, and we can measure the g-force inside this object. The g-forces are several hundred times the force of gravity. In other words, any living person's bones would be crushed by these objects, so they're probably drones of some sort. These objects can drop 70,000 feet in a few seconds. Think about that. It can drop a tremendous distance in just a few seconds, and they can go underwater. This is something that we didn't realize before, but yes, they can actually go underwater. And they also move without creating an exhaust or breaking the sound barrier.
To be frank, after hearing everything Michio described, it's almost impossible to imagine how we could even stand a chance against these aliens if it ever came to that. Their tech is so far beyond anything we have, it's like bringing a knife to a laser fight. Joe puts Michio on the spot, asking about his personal stance on UFOs. Michio shares how his perspective has evolved, going from a complete skeptic to someone who's now open to the possibility.
So for yourself, what was the shift? And how did you feel about UFOs, say like 10, 15 years ago?
Well, there is this giggle factor, and it's the third rail, of course, of your scientific reputation, if you believe in these things. But the evidence is accumulating over the last several years. Now, when I was first approached by Carolyn Corey, the producer of this film, A Tear in the Sky, I was skeptical. I said to myself, come on. I mean, 5 days? 5 days you're going to look for flying saucers in the sky? What happens if the aliens are camera shy and they don't show up in 5 days? So I was pleasantly surprised when they actually found something. They actually have photographic evidence of objects that can gyrate just the way the Pentagon has said. And so we now have a sea change. A center of gravity has changed with regards to looking at these objects. We no longer simply look at one individual seeing something in the sky. No, we demand hours of videotape, multiple sightings by multiple modes. That's the gold standard now.
The two then discuss the possibility that these alien sightings might actually be cutting-edge tech from countries like China or Russia. And as an example, Michio highlights the hypersonic drones Russia uses to bomb Ukraine.
Do you think that this is something that maybe another government from another country has created that far surpasses our abilities, or do you think that this is coming from somewhere else?
Well, the Pentagon has listed, I think, 5 different options. One option, of course, is that they're weather balloons or something that's an artifact of our space program. Maybe a piece of rocket that is plunging back into the Earth's atmosphere. That's one category. Another category is anomalous weather events. They happen, and they have to be looked at very carefully. But the last option is other. That is not just the Russians or the Chinese, because these objects apparently can gyrate faster than what the Chinese and the Russians can muster, but it opened the door to the possibility of other. They didn't specify what other was, but you can fill in the dots yourself. Now, one possibility for other is hypersonic drones. We see that in warfare now. The Russians, in the Battle of Ukraine, is actually using hypersonic drones to hit targets inside Ukraine.
Hypersonic speed implies that the object is moving faster than 5 times the speed of sound, and in terms of numbers, that's roughly 3,836 miles per hour, depending on atmospheric conditions. Now picture this. You see something moving insanely fast across the sky. So fast it almost doesn't seem real. It's easy to think that has to be aliens, and this is exactly Michio's point. He suggests that many of these so-called UFO sightings might actually be hypersonic drones, not extraterrestrial spacecrafts. It's a theory that flips the narrative and makes you wonder if the aliens really exist.
Is there anything that's theoretical that you're aware of that could be applied, like from some other planet or some other galaxy or whatever, that is something that maybe we have theorized that could be responsible for the way these things are able to move?
Well, when I talk to my friends who are physicists like myself about these things, they sort of laugh, giggle, their eyes roll up to the heavens, and they say something very simple, that a rocket using conventional means would take 70,000 years to reach us from the nearest star. Therefore, these objects cannot exist. 70,000 years for a Saturn rocket traveling at 25,000 miles per hour to go from a nearest star to the planet Earth. That's why most scientists disregard these sightings, because they defy the laws of Einstein.
Joe disagrees with this logic. He argues that thinking is too narrow. Comparing alien travel with our current technology assumes that alien civilization is only slightly ahead of us. But what if they are thousands of years ahead of us? Their technology could be operating on principles that completely rewrite what we understand about physics.
But isn't that kind of silly? Isn't that kind of like saying, you know how long it would take you to get a horse from Los Angeles to Sydney, Australia? Isn't that kind of like saying that?
Exactly. And that's why I say that assumes that these aliens or whatever are maybe 100 years more advanced than us. But open your mind to the possibility that they are 1,000 years more advanced than us.
Up next, Joe Rogan is mind blown by James Fox's story about a group of students at a local school in Zimbabwe, Africa. The students not only witnessed a UFO landing on their playground, but also claimed to have communicated with the aliens through telepathy. This is a conversation from episode number 1574.
I was doing my first documentary back in 1997 when I was just naive enough to think I can get an interview with Steven Spielberg. We had a mutual friend involved, this woman Janet. And she gets back to me and she's like, yeah, so Spielberg's definitely not going to meet with you, but he knows you're working on this UFO documentary. He thinks you should look into this landing case that happened in Africa at the school. And I said to myself at the time, and remind you guys that I was making a film on UFOs. And I dismissed it so quickly because I thought there's no way that a mass landing with the sheer volume of eyewitness testimony at a school in broad daylight could happen and the whole world not know about it. So I just walked away from that story for about 10 years.
James later found his way back to the story a decade later when he met a man named Randall Nicholson. At the time, Randall was investigating the UFO landing case at the school in Africa. Intrigued, Randall invited James to collaborate on a small piece of the story.
So I got back into it. I licensed some of the footage that Dr. John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist that came and interviewed the school children on camera within a week of it happening. He unfortunately looked the wrong way in London, got run down by a car and died. So I contacted the Institute with the help of Randall Nicholson. I licensed the archival footage. We tracked down the witnesses today. We flew them in from all different corners of the world, brought them together. A lot of them were standing right next to each other. They came face to face, and one of the things I've realized was that there were roughly 100 kids in the playground, broad daylight, aerial school, Ruwa, Zimbabwe, 1994. and they got within some of them within arm's length of these beings, and brought these witnesses together for the first time in 20 years. And a lot of them hadn't even told their significant others, just because they said they were tired of having to defend this. And I myself didn't believe it when I first heard about it back in 1997.
Joe talks about how real and emotional the Ariel School UFO incident feels. He explains that the kids who saw it weren't actors. They couldn't have faked their reactions. Their stories seemed way too real to be made up.
It's so compelling because the children are all clearly, they're not actors. So as they're adults later, they're all talking about this moment, and it's like they had a religious experience together. Like they're all sharing it and talking about it, and you could tell it's like it's a deeply moving experience. If they were actors, they wouldn't have been able to do such a good job, because to convey the reality of that moment to them, to be able to have this interpretation of this event where they're all consistent in the story and they're all clearly still shook by this moment. It's really interesting because if you had that scene in a movie, it would take like a really good actor to pull it off, and they'd probably need multiple takes. They'd probably want to get the best one. But those kids, the way they were talking about it and the way they were drawing it, you're like, wow, it really does seem like something happened to them.
Take a look at some of the drawings made by the children who witnessed the UFO landing. Just like the school in Zimbabwe, James shares another fascinating story of a UFO encounter at a different school. And this time, it wasn't just the kids. A school teacher also witnessed the landing.
During the production of the film, Paula Harris actually turned me on to another landing case that happened in Australia in 1966 at a school. And this time, there were roughly 300 witnesses that saw a disc land right outside a playground in Australia. And we went to Australia and investigated that case, went to the landing site, talked to eyewitness testimony, people that jumped the fence at the school playground and ran over to where this thing landed. And then we even interviewed a guy who snapped a photograph of a disc, a Polaroid, back in 1966, 2 days prior to the incident. So it's very probably that we have photographic evidence, we have eyewitness testimony, and for the first time we've got testimony from a science teacher.
Here's the Polaroid image of the UFO James is talking about. Up next, Joe Rogan shares a wild story with Kurt Metzger about the late actor and comedian Jackie Gleason and President Nixon. According to Joe, a night of drinking between the two took an unexpected turn when Nixon allegedly gave Gleason a personal tour of a UFO wreckage site complete with frozen biological entities. It's a story so crazy, you have to hear it to believe it. This is a conversation from episode number 1903.
Jackie Gleason got drunk with Nixon. And Nixon's like, you want to see a fucking flying saucer?
Yeah.
And he's like, yes. And then they flew to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, I believe was the rumor. And they showed him, like, we have actually
like they had freezers of them, right? They had them in
I don't know if
freezers?
that's real. I've never heard anybody say that they saw a body and have it be like 100% credible.
For context, Jackie Gleason was one of America's most beloved comedians and television stars. Nixon and Gleason first became friends over their shared love of golf. They would occasionally have informal meetings where they exchanged stories and engaged in light-hearted banter. However, this meeting would be unforgettable.
Entered a section, Nixon pointed out what he said was the wreckage of a flying saucer enclosed in several large cases. Next, we went to an inner chamber. There were 6 or 8 what looked like glass-topped Coke freezers. Inside them were the mangled remains of what I took to be children. Oh, that's right.
Yeah, that's the thing I remember from this story.
So I'm conflating this with something else. So that's right, they did have fucking supposedly dead frozen ones. The revelation of the U.S. Secretary holding the corpses of dead aliens shook Gleason to the core, and he couldn't eat or sleep for weeks. After being confronted by his wife, Beverly, Gleason told her the truth about that night and swore her to secrecy, but Jackie and Beverly Gleason were already in the process of separating. The final straw in the relationship would be Beverly breaking her vow and revealing the encounter to the magazine Esquire in 1974 as a teaser for a book she was writing about her relationship with the tempestuous, hard-drinking Jackie.
This event had affected Gleason for the rest of his life, according to friends and family. They began to notice him drinking more. 12 years later, Gleason would finally break his silence. After a few drinks, he would begin to retell the story to Larry Warren, a UFO enthusiast.
I wonder what that article. So that article was this where this story first came out.
Yeah, I guess so. And stung and humiliated by the betrayal, Jackie stayed silent until 1986. Finally ready to talk, he invited Larry Warren, a flying saucer evangelist, author, and eyewitness to the Rendell Sam Forest UFO incident, to his New York home. After a few drinks, Gleason unloaded the whole unbelievable tale to an astonished Warren, who spread the story amongst his community. However, the story would end there. Gleason died a year later, having only told his ex-wife and Warren about the once-in-a-lifetime adventure with Nixon. The tale would spread like wildfire with the advent of the internet, confirming what UFO believers already knew. The government knows everything about aliens, but reveal it only to the privileged.
Up next, Travis Walton describes his encounter with a UFO while working a logging job in the woods. Not only was he within close range, he also believes he had an energy exchange with the craft. This is a conversation from episode number 1597.
Let's take it back to the day that this happened. You're 22, you're logging, you're in the woods. Tell me what happened.
Well, it's just, when you're done working hard physical labor, everybody's kind of jacked up, and there was a whole lot of chatter in the car. We're just talking away, it's starting to get dark. We just loaded up our equipment. We're headed out. And I looked up ahead, and I saw this kind of glow coming through the trees. First I thought, no big deal, it was deer hunting season. Thought maybe there was some hunters camped up on the hill up there. Maybe light shining through a tent. It was still something really strange, kind of caught my eye. And one by one, the other guys in the crew started looking, but nobody said, "Oh my God, what's that?" or anything like that. It was just kind of an idle curiosity at first. But when we burst into the clearing where we could see the source of this glow, it was just, whoa, it was just mind-blowing.
For context, a group of loggers, including the 22-year-old Travis Walton, experienced a mysterious event while driving home after a day of hard work in the woods. As they were leaving, Travis noticed a glow in the woods. At first he dismissed it, but as they drove closer, the glow caught everyone's attention. And when they got to the source of the light, it wasn't anything they could have imagined. They were stunned to see a UFO hovering in front of them, glowing brightly.
So what did the craft itself look like?
It was a classic disc-shaped craft. Years later, there was a report. I can never remember names, but this guy was saying that he worked at Area 51, and they had something in there. He worked with the Tester Model Corporation to create a model of what he was describing, and that's actually the closest of any of the other descriptions I've seen. But I don't think these things have just one type of craft. I think there's many, many different shapes.
Joe dives deeper, pressing Travis for details about what happened after he saw the UFO. Travis then provides a vivid and detailed account of the encounter, walking Joe through every moment of what he experienced.
Recently.
Yeah. So you see this thing, this disc-shaped craft,
yeah.
and then what happens?
It started to move and started to get louder.
Louder?
Yeah. It was the guys in the truck heard it too. There was a low, thunderous kind of a rumble that you actually sort of felt more than heard. And then there were other high-pitched frequencies. I was talking to a group of students from technical college, and they were really interested in what the sound was like to try to, compare that with theories that they had concerning what might be their propulsion. But the increase in volume, it suddenly got louder as it started to move. And, at the same time, the guys in the truck were screaming, "Get away from there, let's go, get back in the truck, let's go." And, which would have been the smart thing to do. But as soon as it moved, it startled me, and I just ducked for cover.
Travis details a mysterious energy discharge from the UFO when he got closer to it. He also speculates that the discharge may not have been deliberate. Instead, he believes his close proximity to the UFO could have allowed an energy field from the craft to channel through his body.
When I jumped for cover, I went down and forward to reach where the log would hide me. And that brought me closer to it. So when I stood up, at that point, that was the closest I was to the object.
How close?
It was still like 8 or 10 feet away, you know, from the surface of it. But that was when the energy discharge happened. I've worked on a number of theories about what might have happened. At the time, some of the other guys on the truck were thinking, immediately Steve said, it got him. Like, you know, if you shot a deer, you got it, you know?
Right.
And so it might not have been, as we assumed at first, that it was some kind of stun gun or something, but maybe just closing that gap allowed this energy to leap to ground through me.
Travis later discovered that the area where he encountered the UFO has one of the highest frequencies of lightning strikes in the continental United States, and he believes that the location may have been significant to the UFO.
One thing that really weighs heavy in that direction is that when I found years later that they have satellites or something that record the number of lightning strikes, and that area has the highest frequency of lightning strikes of any place in the continental United States, except for the Everglades. The Everglades has a bit more, but that's over water. So that adds to another theory. What were they doing there?
To end this segment, Joe asks if they are observing the aliens, what could be attracting the aliens, and Travis responded that he believes the aliens were looking for a certain type of crystal called fulgurite.
Do you think it makes sense that they're observing that, or is that why they were there? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, up until a few years ago, you know, you walk down the rim road, and if you see a tree that's been hit by lightning, you can always see it. It's a strip of bark that's just blasted out of there, and it's all bare. And it can actually still survive the lightning strike, but it turns the sap to steam instantly, and it just explodes out the side of the tree, blows the bark off. But I was at a conference where this lady was, I said, what's this? And she says, that's fulgurite. I said, what's that? And she says, that's when lightning strikes the earth. You've got millions of volts, millions of degrees that form these crystals that aren't formed geologically. So I kind of leaned towards this theory that perhaps they were looking for fulgurite, for a very unique kind of crystal that would be formed by that kind of blast of energy. I'd never heard of fulgurite before.
Up next, Joe Rogan is met with the story of strange encounters and weird sightings of UFOs in Ohio from Patrick Carney of the Black Keys. They also discuss how the government might be keeping these mysteries from the public. This is a conversation from episode number 2118.
Anyway, I was driving out there and I saw this thing hovering over a house. And it was, you know, I took note because like no fly zone. It was like,
right.
And it looked like a helicopter or something, like, because there was a light coming down, but no other lights. And, but it was like only 100 feet above this house in the middle of nowhere, right along the same stretch of road where I'd seen this fireball a couple days earlier. And I was driving a stick shift Ford Escort, and I put it in neutral and rolled down the windows as I got closer, and there was like no sound coming from this thing. And my girlfriend had like one of those Nextel phones, the early cell phone, and she turned it on because like you should call someone, like call the police or something. This is insane. And the minute like the screen turned on, this thing just like took off. It didn't go like thousands of miles an hour, but it went really, really fast. It made no sound. It just was like.
The two then discuss Ohio's history of strange alien sightings and the controversy surrounding the alleged storage of alien remains at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Joe criticizes the government for keeping information about the alien secret, while many people die without ever knowing the truth.
You see weird shit like in Ohio because there's Wright-Patterson Air Force Base there.
Yeah.
One time I was driving and a Harrier just like pops up. Like, you know, those planes that can kind of just popped up like right maybe 100 yards from the road. But yeah, that's what they apparently keep the alien corpses, you know.
Yeah, that's what they supposedly flew the wreckage from Roswell, New Mexico, to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
It's a good place to keep it because I'm from Ohio and I've never actually been into Dayton, Ohio. So just the outside of Dayton.
If they do still have that there, that's really rude. You should let people see that.
Yeah.
If you guys really did find a fucking crashed UFO, how about a little heads up? It's rude. It's rude that they've had it for so long, and we've just been, people go to their grave just guessing.
As the conversation carries on, Patrick suggests that the government might be handing over recovered alien materials to private defense contractors to maintain secrecy. Joe confirms this theory. He compares this to how the government outsources the production of advanced weaponry to specialized companies. Patrick also mentions a mysterious building in Akron, Ohio, which he believes might be related to top-secret government projects or alien technology.
Apparently the recovered materials and stuff, in order to not have to turn it over to the public, they keep just giving it to private defense contractors.
Really?
That's who holds the materials. I think that's what.
Well, I would imagine if I was the government and I had a crashed UFO, that's why I'd bring it to the private defense contractors. They're already good at keeping secrets. They already know how to make your weapons, and they know how to do stuff that you don't know how to do. They're doing it for you. Like, it's not like the fucking government themselves makes the missiles. They hire people to make the missiles.
There's this massive building in Akron called the Air Dock. It was built in the late 20s so they could build blimps, because they used to build all the blimps in Akron.
It's incredible. Looks like Star Wars.
I mean, it's fucking nuts.
Because it's right in the middle of a neighborhood.
It rains.
Whoa.
It has its own atmosphere. It rains inside there.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's the most ominous looking structure.
Take a look at this image of the air dock. This massive structure, measuring 1,175 feet long, 325 feet wide and 211 feet high, is over 4 times the length of a standard football field. Now, if Patrick's theory is true, this place will be perfect for the government to hide top secret alien discoveries. Think about it, a massive, secure facility hidden in plain sight. To end this segment, Joe explores the idea that most so-called alien sightings are just government drones or classified aircrafts. Makes sense, right? The government isn't exactly obligated to disclose everything they find to the public. And let's be real, the last thing they'd ever admit is discovering extraterrestrial life.
I think most of what people are seeing is a government aircraft. Either a drone or something.
That's why they won't even acknowledge the hypersonic missile. Like they just announced that they're like discontinuing research on the hypersonic missile when clearly they must have it must be fully operational.
Yeah, I would imagine they would tell us. Like, they don't have to.
Yeah,
That's one of the most incredible things about the way the government works.
Yeah.
Is that the amount of money that they get. That was the argument for the reason why this hasn't been disclosed. Like, the government doesn't want to come out and say,
well,
it was the money allocation. Like, you had to have lied to Congress about where the money was going.
Well, someone was saying, like, it's like the opposite of brinkmanship. Like, there's weapons that exist that if other countries knew they existed, would just be such a fucking threat that it would cause a war. Just the idea that someone had something like that no other country had.
Up next, Joe Rogan is met with a wild story from James Fox about a mysterious VHS tape he was invited to watch. The tape reportedly showed 2 teenagers encountering a UFO during a road trip to Area 51. Even Logan Paul got involved, visiting to verify the story for himself. This is a conversation from episode number 1976.
I was interviewing this guy out at Area 50. He was lived on the outskirts of the base in a place called near the Little Alien in Rachel, Nevada. And this guy's name is Chuck Clark, and he had found all these, and the relevance of what I'm telling you will come to light in a second here. He'd found all these vantage points on the mountaintops that he could spy on the base down below with high-powered telescopes, with cameras. And he was taking photographs of different exotic airplanes coming out of the hangars and stuff like that. He wrote a book called UFO Area 51 Handbook and Guide or something.
For context, in 1995, while working on a UFO documentary, James Fox was invited to Chuck's home to watch a VHS tape that he promised to be absolutely mind-blowing. Without hesitation, James traveled from his home in Northern California all the way to Nevada to meet Chuck. And this is where things start to get very interesting.
Get to his house, and he's got a double wide right near the Little Alien. And he pops in this VHS tape. It was like 2 guys on the quintessential road trip just to Area 50, the surrounding areas, Rachel and the extraterrestrial lonely highway, and they're goofing off the alien, taking videos of each other, just the typical road trip out to Area 51, right?
Blair Witch Project.
Totally. And then they're goofing off next to the photographs of the alien in the crash disc, and then they're inside the little alien, and I'm like, okay, where's this going? Then all of a sudden, and I saw this with my own eyes, all of a sudden, the car's parked, and it's parked out by the black mailbox in the desert, and it's dusk. The camera is on the armrest between the two seats, and it's slightly cocked, like it's not level. And it's filming the dashboard and the screen, the windscreen, and there's two guys in there sounding like, you can't see them, sounding like they're trying to crawl under the seats. I mean, they're freaking out. And then one of them goes, it's over the top of us. It's over the top of us. I'm like, damn, what is this video?
The story gets even more intense as James describes the two guys arguing over whether to stay in the car or get out, all while the UFO moves even closer to the ground.
Then all of a sudden, the car lights up on the inside, but the source of light is above it. Like if you could imagine, I've never seen anything like this. If you could put a pendulum with a light source above a vehicle, like above the car, like this, but very slow and fluid motion, like rocking back and forth. The shadows and the lights on the inside of the car are doing this really eerily. You've never seen anything like it. I'm looking like, my God, what is going on? And they're very scared. And one kid, who's the younger of the two, is like, I'm getting out. I'm getting out of the car. Stay in the car. It's over the top of us. Stay in the fucking car. He goes, no, I'm getting out. And he gets out and he videotapes a disc that was so low you could have hit it with a rock. And I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, that's what all the witnesses have tried to describe.
James breaks down what the UFO on the tape looked like. He describes it as a glowing yellow-orange disc with a surface that almost seemed alive. He also suggests that the video could be the ultimate proof to settle the debate of whether aliens are real or not.
The skin on the craft glowing like phosphorus on a beach, that's what it looked like the skin was alive. And it had like a yellowy orange color to it. But you could clearly see it was a disc. I mean, it was not an orb. It was a disc. But the metal lit up like it was alive. I'd never seen anything like it. And it just wobbled like it was unstable, like doing this. And the camera guy goes, oh my God. And then something about the batteries, and then boom, it shuts off. I looked over at Chuck Clark. I said, this is the video everyone's been waiting for. Unbelievable.
Joe doesn't just take James's story at face value. He digs in, asking the hard questions, the same ones you're probably thinking about right now. Who exactly is Chuck Clark? Why has no one else seen this video? And how exactly did Chuck get his hands on this tape?
How do you know this is real? Because
if it's not real,
all my BS meters are going off right now.
Dude, fair enough. I get it. Fair enough. I saw this video with my own eyes.
Of course. Yeah. It's a video, though.
It's a video, for sure. No question about it.
No, they make fake videos.
Absolutely. It was 1995, and they could have. But why wouldn't...
1995 is harder.
Yeah, but why? It's never been released to the public. Why would you create a fake video?
What year did you see it?
I saw it like 95.
And so it's out there somewhere?
No, it's not. It's in Chuck Clark's... got a copy of it. The story continues.
No, but I mean, someone has it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, in fact, if those two boys that shot it are out there, please come forward. Like, please.
How come no one's acquired this?
So I said to Chuck, oh my God, this is great. I can use this in my movie. Right? Great. He goes, oh no, they're terrified. I said, well, look, just put me in touch with the guys. You don't have to give.
But wait a minute. They're terrified, but they give it to a guy who lives in a trailer?
I'm just telling you.
Do you know what I'm saying, though?
Absolutely.
Hey, I'm really terrified. I don't want this getting out, but I'm going to give it to you.
I get it.
Guy who lives in a trailer.
I get it.
What does this guy do for a living?
He was a former military guy, and he's retired. But
just a retired military guy
for a minute
in a trailer. This guy's a Fed. So that he doesn't even live there.
But no,
he probably put on some fucking overalls to hang out with you.
The story gets better.
Is his name Ray Epps?
James tells Rogan that he tried to buy the video from Chuck, but Chuck refused to sell. He also reveals that a private investigator reached out, claiming to have seen the video as well. But then Logan Paul heard the story. James says he was just as blown away as Joe is right now.
As I went on a couple of podcasts and I said, screw it, I don't care anymore. I saw this video, I'm going to start talking about it. Chuck Clark said, if you ask me again after like 10 years or 12 years, I'm never talking to you again. So I was like, I of course asked him again. I said, I'll give you 30 grand for the video, and he's not talking to me. So I went on like a Concrete podcast, and I went on this guy Julian Dorian's podcast, and I went on a bunch of other podcasts, and I gave the whole story. Let's let somebody else pick up the ball and run with it. I'm just telling you what I saw, okay? I get contacted a couple of years ago by a guy who goes, I saw that video too. Then another guy contacts me, and he goes, I'm a private investigator, and I find people. I said, well, his name's Chuck Clark. Go to it. So he finds him. Right at that time, I'm going on the Impulsive podcast with Logan Paul, and I tell Logan Paul the story, and he has exactly the same response you have.
While Joe is still skeptical about the story, James drops another bombshell. He claims Logan Paul actually went out to look for Chuck. According to James, Logan offered Chuck $100,000 to buy the video. But here's where it gets even crazier. Logan allegedly used a hidden button camera to secretly record the tape since Chuck refused to sell.
I put him in touch with this guy, and this guy lives in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was like Logan Paul takes a Mercedes with a bunch of guys and $100,000 in cash, a big brick. And he goes out to this guy's house in the middle of the desert. And Logan calls me in the middle of nowhere. He's like, are you sure your contact's legit, dude? My phone doesn't work. I'm in the middle of nowhere. I got $100K cash in my pocket, and I can't find this guy. I said, no, I'm sure he's good, you know? And so Logan goes in there and meets Chuck Clark. And Chuck Clark's like, yeah, I got the tape right here. And so he says, I'll give you $100,000 for it. And the guy says, no way. And so Logan Paul revealed this for the first time. Logan Paul has got a button camera on his dress, on his clothes. So Logan Paul's like, all right, well, this guy doesn't want to, he's going to die with it. So let's get this thing on camera. So Logan's like, well, let me see it at least. So Logan looks at it with this thing and, oh, could you show it to me again? Gets another angle, and then he leaves. So Logan's like, I don't know if I want to go public. I mean, I don't really own the video. I don't know. It seems like a bit of a gray zone.
Lights are going up, snow is falling down. There's a feeling of goodwill around town. It could only mean one thing. McRib is here. People throwing parties, ugly sweaters everywhere. Stockings hung up by the chimney with care. It could only mean one thing. McRib is here.
At participating McDonald's for a limited time.
So Rome always wins because even if they lose battles, they go to the Italian allies and half-citizens and raise new armies. So how do you beat them? He can never raise that many troops himself. And Hannibal, I think, correctly figures out the one way to maybe defeat Rome is to cut them away from their allies. Well, how do you do this? Hannibal's plan is, I'm not going to wait and fight the Romans in Spain or North Africa. I'm going to invade Italy. So I'm going to strike at the heart of this growing Roman Empire. And my hope is that if I can win a couple big battles against Rome in Italy, the Italians will want their freedom back. And they'll rebel from Rome and maybe even join me. Because most people who have been conquered want their freedom back. So this is a reasonable plan. So Hannibal famously crosses the Alps with elephants, dramatic stuff. Nobody expects him to do this. Nobody thinks you can do this. Shows up in northern Italy. Romans send an army. Hannibal massacres them. He is a military genius. Rome takes a year, raises a second army. We know this story. Sends it against Hannibal. Hannibal wipes him out. Rome gets clever this time. They say, okay, Hannibal's different. We're going to take 2 years, raise 2 armies, and send them both out at the same time against Hannibal. So they do this, and this is the Battle of Cannae, which is one of the most famous battles in history. Hannibal is facing this army of 80,000 Romans about, and he comes up with a strategy called double envelopment. I mean, we can go into it later if you want, but it's this famous strategy where he basically kind of sucks the Romans in, surrounds them on all sides, and in one afternoon at the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal kills about 60,000 Romans. Now, just to put that in perspective, that's more Romans hacked to death in one afternoon with swords than Americans died in 20 years in Vietnam.
The following is a conversation with Gregory Aldrete, a historian specializing in ancient Rome and military history. This is the Lex Friedman podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Gregory Aldrete. What do you think is the big difference between the ancient world and the modern world?
Well, the easy answer, the one you often get, is technology. And obviously, there's huge differences in technology between the ancient world and today. But I think some of the more interesting stuff is a little bit more amorphous things, more structural things. So I would say, first of all, childhood mortality. In the ancient world, and this is true of Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, really anybody up until about the Industrial Revolution, about 30 to 40% of kids died before they hit puberty. So, I mean, put yourself in the place of an average inhabitant of the ancient world. If you were an ancient person, 3 or 4 of your kids probably would have died. You would have buried your children. And nowadays we think of that as an unusual thing. And just psychologically, that's a huge thing. You would have seen multiple of your siblings die. If you're a woman, for example, if you were lucky enough to make it to, let's say, age 13, you probably would have to give birth 4 or 5 times in order just to keep the population from dying out. So those kind of grim mortality statistics, I think, are a huge difference psychologically between the ancient world and the modern.
But fundamentally, do you think human nature changed much? Do you think this is the same elements of what we see today? Fear, greed, love, hope, optimism, and cynicism, the underlying forces that result in war, all of that permeates human history?
Crude answer, yes. I think human nature is roughly constant. And for me, as an ancient historian, the kind of documents that I really like dealing with are not the traditional literary sources, but they're the things that give us those little glimpses into everyday life. So stuff like tombstones or graffiti or just something that survives on a scrap of parchment that records a financial transaction. And whenever I read some of those, I'll have this moment of, feeling, oh, I know exactly how that person felt. Here across 2,000 years of time, completely different cultures, I have this spark of sympathy with someone from antiquity. And I think as a historian, the way you begin to understand an alien, a foreign culture, which is what these cultures are, is to look for those little moments of sympathy. But on the other hand, there's ways in which ancient cultures are wildly different from us. So you also look for those moments where you just think, how the hell could these people have done that? I just don't understand how they could have thought or acted in this way. And it's lining up those moments of sympathy and kind of disconnection that I think is when you begin to start to understand a foreign culture or an ancient culture.
I love the idea of assembling the big picture from the details, from the little pieces, because that is the thing that makes up life. Yeah. The big picture is nothing without the details.
Yep. And those details would bring it to life. Yeah. I mean, it's not the grand sweep of things. It's seeing those little hopes and fears. Another thing that I think is a huge difference between the modern world and the ancient is just basically everybody's a farmer. Everybody's a small family farmer. And we forget this.
Yeah.
I was just writing a lecture for my next Great Courses course, and I was writing about farming in the ancient world. And I was really thinking, if we were to write a realistic textbook of, let's say, the Roman Empire, 9 out of 10 chapters should be details of what it was like to be a small-time family farmer, because that's what 90% of the people in the ancient world did. They weren't soldiers, they weren't priests, they weren't kings, they weren't authors, they weren't artists. They were small-town family farmers. And they lived in a little village. They never traveled 20 miles from that village. They were born there. They married somebody from there. They raised kids. They mucked around in the dirt for a couple decades, and they died. They never saw a battle. They never saw a work of art. They never saw a philosopher. They never took part in any of the things we define as being history. So that's what life should be, and that's representative.
Nevertheless, it is the emperors and the philosophers and the artists and the warriors who carve history.
And it is the important stuff. So, I mean, that's true. There's a reason we focus on that.
That's a good reminder, though. If we want to truly empathize and understand what life was like, we have to represent it fully.
And I would say let's not forget them. So let's not forget what life was like for 80, 90% of the people in the ancient world, the ones we don't talk about, because that's important too.
So the Roman Empire is widely considered to be the most powerful, influential, and impactful empire in human history. What are some reasons for that?
Yeah, I mean, Rome has been hugely influential, I think, just because of the image. I mean, there's all these practical ways. I mean, the words I'm using to speak with you today, 30% are direct from Latin, another 30% are from Latin descended languages. Our law codes, I mean, our habits, our holidays, everything comes fairly directly from the ancient world. But the image of Rome, at least again in Western civilization, has really been the dominant image of a successful empire. And I think that's what gives it a lot of its fascination. This idea that, oh, it was this great, powerful, culturally influential empire. And there's a lot of other empires. I mean, we could talk about ancient China, which arguably was just as big as Rome, just as culturally sophisticated, lasted about the same amount of time. But at least in Western civilization, Rome is the paradigm. But Rome is a little schizophrenic in that it's both the empire when it was ruled by emperors, which is one kind of model, and it's the Roman Republic when it was a pseudo democracy, which is a different model. And it's interesting how some later civilizations tend to either focus on one or the other of those. So, the United States, Revolutionary France, they were very obsessed with the Roman Republic as a model. But other people, Mussolini, Hitler, Napoleon, they were very obsessed with the empire, Victorian Britain, as a model. So Rome itself has different aspects. Well, what I think is actually another big difference between the modern world and the ancient is our relationship with the past.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the keys to understanding all of Roman history is to understand that this was a people who were obsessed with the past and for whom the past had power, not just as something inspirational, but it actually dictated what you would do in your daily life. And today, especially in the United States, we don't have much of a relationship with the past. We see ourselves as free agents, just floating along, not tethered to what came before. And the classical story that I sometimes tell in my classes to illustrate this is Rome started out as a monarchy. They had kings. They were kind of unhappy with their kings. Around 500 BC, they held a revolution and they kicked out the kings. And one of the guys who played a key role in this was a man named Lucius Junius Brutus. Okay. 500 years later, 500 years down the road, a guy comes along, Julius Caesar, who starts to act like a king. So if you have trouble with kings in Roman society, who are you going to call? Somebody named Brutus. Now, as it happens, there is a guy named Brutus in Roman society at this time who is one of Julius Caesar's best friends, Marcus Junius Brutus. Now, before I go further with the story, and I think you probably know where it ends, I just have to talk about how important your ancestors are in Roman culture. I mean, if you went to an aristocratic Roman's house and opened the front door and walked in, the first thing you would see would be a big wooden cabinet. And if you open that up, what you would see would be row after row of wax death masks. So when a Roman aristocrat died, they literally put hot wax on his face and made an impression of his face at that moment. And they hung these in a big cabinet right inside the front door. So every time you entered your house, you were literally staring at the faces of your ancestors. And every child in that family would have obsessively memorized every accomplishment of every one of those ancestors. He would have known their career, what offices they held, what battles they fought in, what they did. When somebody new in the family died, there would be a big funeral, and they would talk about all the things their ancestors had did. The kids in the family would literally take out those masks, tie them onto their own faces, and wear them in the funeral procession. So you were like wearing the face of your ancestors. So you as an individual weren't important. You were just the latest iteration of that family. And there was enormous weight, huge weight, to live up to the deeds of your ancestors. So the Romans were absolutely obsessed with the past, especially with your own family. Every Roman kid who was, let's say, an aristocratic family could tell you every one of his ancestors back centuries. I can't go beyond my grandparents. I don't even know, but that's, maybe 100 years. So it's a completely different attitude towards the past.
And the level of celebration that we have now of the ancestors, even the ones we can name, is not as intense as it was in Roman times.
No, I mean, it was obsessive and oppressive. It determined what you
Oppressive.
did.
Oh,
Yes, because there's that weight for you to act like your ancestors did.
do you think, not to speak sort of philosophically, but do you think it was limiting to the way the society develops to be
Yes,
deeply constrained by the limiting in a good way or a bad way, you think?
Well, like everything, it's a little of both. But the bad, so on the one hand, it gives them enormous strength and it gives them this enormous connection. It gives them guidance. But the negatives, what's interesting, is it makes the Romans extremely traditional minded and extremely conservative. And I mean conservative in the sense of resistant to change. So in the late Republic, which we'll probably talk about later, Rome desperately needed to change certain things, but it was a society that did things the way the ancestors did it, and they didn't make some obvious changes which might have saved their republic. So that's the downside, is that it locks you into something and you can't change. But to get us back to the Brutuses, so 500 years after that first Brutus got rid of kings, Julius Caesar starts to act like a king. One of his best friends is Marcus Junius Brutus, and literally in the middle of the night, people go to Brutus's house and write graffiti on it that says, "Remember your ancestor." And another one is, I think, "You're no real Brutus." And at that point, he really has no choice. He forms a conspiracy, and on the Ides of March 44 BC, he and 23 other senators take daggers, stick them in Julius Caesar, and kill him for acting like a king. So the way I always pose this to my students is, how many of you would stick a knife in your best friend because of what your great 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 grandfather did?
That's commitment.
That's the power of the past.
Yeah.
That's a society where the past isn't just influential, but it dictates what you do. And that concept, I think, is very alien to us today. We can't imagine murdering our best friend because of what some incredibly distant ancestor did 500 years ago. But to Brutus, there is no choice. You have to do that. And a lot of societies have this power of the past. Today, not so much, but some still do. About a decade ago, I was in Serbia, and I was talking to some of the people there about the breakup of Yugoslavia and some of the wars that had taken place where people turned against their neighbors, basically murdered people they had lived next to for decades. And when I was talking to them, some of them actually brought up things like, oh, well, it was justified because in this battle in 12 whatever, they did this. And I was thinking, wow, you're citing something from 800 years ago to justify your actions today. That's a modern person who still understands the power of the past, or maybe is, crippled by it, is another way to view it.
So this is an interesting point and an interesting perspective to remember about the way the Romans thought, especially in the context of how power is transferred, whether it's hereditary or not, which changes throughout Roman history. So it's interesting. It's interesting to remember that, the value of the ancestors.
Yep. And just the weight of tradition. For the Romans, the mos maiorum is this Latin term, which means the way the ancestors did it. And it's kind of their word for tradition. So for them, tradition is what your forefathers and mothers did. And you have to follow that example and you have to live up to that.
Does that mean that class mobility was difficult? So if your ancestors were farmers, there was a major constraint on remaining a farmer, essentially.
For the ones who get it done, the most important part is the one you need now. And the best partner is the one who can deliver. That's why millions of maintenance and repair pros trust Grainger, because we have professional-grade supplies for every industry, even hard-to-find products. And we have same-day pickup and next-day delivery on most orders. But most importantly, we have an unwavering commitment to help keep you up and running. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
I mean, the Romans all like to think of themselves as farmers, even filthy rich Romans. It was just their national identity, is the citizen soldier farmer thing.
Right.
But it did, among the aristocrats, the people who kind of ran things, it was hard to break into that if you didn't have famous ancestors. And it was such a big deal that there was a specific term called a novus homo, a new man, for someone who was the first person in their family to get elected to a major office in the Roman government, because that was a weird and different and new thing. So you actually designated them by this special term. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
So if we may, let us zoom out. It would help me, maybe it'll help the audience to look at the different periods that we've been talking about. So you mentioned the Republic, you mentioned maybe when it took a form of empire, and maybe there's the Age of Kings. What are the different periods of this Roman, let's call it, what, the big
Roman history.
Roman history.
Yep.
And a lot of people just call that whole period Roman Empire loosely, right? So maybe can you speak to the different periods?
Yes, absolutely. So conventionally, Roman history is divided into 3 chronological periods. The first of those is from 773 BC to 509 BC, which is called the monarchy. So all the periods get their names from the form of government. So this is the earliest phase of Roman history. It's when Rome is mostly just a fairly undistinguished little collection of mud huts, honestly, just like dozens of other cities of little mud huts in Italy. So that early phase, about 750 to around 500 BC, is the monarchy. They're ruled by kings. Then there's this revolution. They kick out the kings. They become a republic. That lasts from 500 BC roughly to about either 31 or 27 BC, depending what date you pick is most important, but about 500 years. And the republic is when they have a republican form of government. Some people idealize this as Rome's greatest period. And the big thing in that period is Rome first expands to conquer all of Italy in the first 250 years of that 500-year stretch. And then the second 250 years, they conquer all the Mediterranean basin, roughly. So this is this time of enormous, successful Roman conquest and expansion. And then you have another switch up, and they become ruled by emperors. So back to the idea of one guy in charge, though the Romans try to pretend it's not like a king, it's something else. And anyway, we can get into that. But they're very touchy about kings. Yeah. So they have emperors. Roman Empire, the first emperor is Augustus. Starts off as Octavian, switches his name to Augustus when he becomes emperor. He kind of sets the model for what happens. And then how long does the Roman Empire last? That's one of those great questions. The conventional answer is usually sometime in the 5th century, so the 400s AD, so about another 500 years, let's say. So nice kind of even division. 500 years of republic, 500 years of empire, but you can make very good cases for lots of other dates for the end of the Roman Empire. I actually think it goes all the way through the end of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, so another 1500 years, but that's a whole nother discussion. But so that's your 3 phases of Roman history.
And in some fundamental way, it still persists today, given how much of its ideas define our modern life, especially in the Western world.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the relationship between ancient Greece and Roman Empire, both in the chronological sense and in the influence sense?
Well, I mean, ancient Greece comes, the classical era of Greek civilization is around the 500s BC. That's when you have the great achievements of Athens. It becomes the first sort of true democracy. They defeat the Persian invasions. A lot of the famous stuff happens around in the 400s, let's say. So that is contemporaneous with Rome, but the Greek civilization sense is peaking earlier. And one of the things that happens is that Greece ends up being conquered by Rome in that second half of the Roman Republic between 250 and about 30 BC. And so Greece falls under the control of Rome, and Rome is very heavily influenced by Greek culture. They themselves see the Greeks as a superior civilization, culturally more sophisticated, great art, great philosophy, all this. And another thing about the Romans is they're super competitive. So one of the things one of the engines that drives Romans is this public competitiveness, especially among the upper classes. They care more about their status and standing among their peers than they do about money or even their own life. So there's this intense competition. And when they conquer Greece, Greek culture just becomes one more arena of competition. So Romans will start to learn Greek. They'll start to memorize Homer. They'll start to see who can quote more passages of Homer in Greek in their letters to one another, because that increases their status. So Rome kind of absorbs Greek civilization, and then the two get fused together. The other thing I should mention in terms of influences that's really huge on Rome is the Etruscans. And this is one that comes along before the Greeks. So the Etruscans were this kind of mysterious culture that flourished in northern Italy before the Romans, so way back 800 BC. They were much more powerful than the Romans. They were kind of a loose confederation of states. For a while, the Romans even seemed to have been under Etruscan control. The last of the Roman kings was really an Etruscan guy, pretty clearly. But the Etruscans end up giving to Rome, or you could say Rome ends up stealing, perhaps, a lot of elements of Etruscan culture. And many of the things that we today think of as distinctively Roman, that, as our cliches of what a Roman is, actually aren't truly Roman. They're stuff they stole from the Etruscans. So just a couple examples. The toga. What do you think of a Roman? It's a guy wearing a toga, and the toga is the mark of Roman citizen. Well, that's what Etruscan kings wore, probably. Gladiator games. We associate those very intensely with the Romans. Well, they probably stole that from the Etruscans. A lot of Roman religion. Jupiter is a thunder god. All sorts of divination. The Romans love to, chop open animals and look at their livers and predict the future. That comes from the Etruscans. Watching the flight of birds to predict the future. That comes from the Etruscans. So there's a lot of central elements of what we think of as Roman civilization, which actually are borrowings, let's say, from these older, slightly mysterious Etruscans.
I mean, that's a really powerful thing. That's a powerful aspect of a civilization to be able to, we can call it stealing, which is a negative connotation, but you can also see it as integration. Yep. Basically, yes, steal the best stuff from the peoples you conquer or the peoples that you interact with. That's not every empire does that. There's a lot of nations and empires that when they conquer, they annihilate versus integrate. And so it's an interesting thing to be able to culturally, like the form that the competitiveness takes is that you want to compete in the realm of ideas and culture versus compete strictly in the realm of military conquest.
Yeah, and I think you've exactly put your finger on one of the, let's say, secrets of Rome's success, which is that they're very good at integrating non-Romans or non-Roman ideas and kind of absorbing them. So one of the things that's absolutely crucial early in Roman history, when they're just one of these tiny little mud hut villages fighting dozens of other mud hut villages in Italy, why does Rome emerge as the dominant one? Well, one of the things they do is when they do finally succeed in conquering somebody else, let's say another Italianate people, they do something very unusual, because the normal procedure in the ancient world is you conquer let's say you conquer another city. You often kill most of the men, enslave the women and children, steal all the stuff, right? The Romans, at least with the Italians, conquer the other city, and sometimes they'll do that, but sometimes they'll also then say, all right, we're going to now leave you alone, and we're going to share with you a degree of Roman citizenship. Sometimes they'd make them full citizens. More often they'd make them something we call half citizens, which is kind of what it sounds like. You get some of the privileges of citizenship, but not all of them. Sometimes they would just make them allies. But they would sort of incorporate them into the Roman project. And they wouldn't necessarily ask for money or taxes, which is weird too. But instead, the one thing they would always demand from the conquered cities in Italy is that they provide troops to the Roman army. So the army becomes this mechanism of Romanization, where you pull in foreigners, you make them like you, and then they end up fighting for you. And early on, the secret to Rome's military success is not that they have better generals, it's not that they have better equipment, it's not that they have better strategy or tactics, it's that they have limitless manpower, relatively speaking. So they lose a war, and they just come back and fight again, and they lose again, and they come back and they fight again. And eventually they just wear down their enemies, because their key thing of their policy is we incorporate the conquered people. And the great moment that just exemplifies this is pretty late in this process. So they've been doing this for 250 years just about, and they've gotten down to the toe of Italy. They're conquering the very last cities down there. And one of the last cities is actually a Greek city. It's a Greek colony. It's a wealthy city, and so when the Romans show up on the doorstep and are about to attack them, they do what any rich Greek colony or city does. They go out and hire the best mercenaries they can. And they hire this guy who thinks of himself as the new Alexander the Great, a man named Pyrrhus of Epirus. So he's a mercenary. He's actually related to Alexander distantly. He has a terrific army, top-notch army. He's got elephants. He's got all the latest military technology. The Romans come and fight a battle against him, and Pyrrhus knows what he's doing. He wipes out the Romans. He thinks, okay, now we'll have a peace treaty, we'll negotiate something, I can go home. But the Romans won't even talk. They go to their Italian allies and half-citizens, they raise a second army, they send it against Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus says, okay, these guys are slow learners, fine. He fights them again, wipes them out. Thinks, now we'll have a peace treaty. But the Romans go back to the allies, raise a third army, and send it after Pyrrhus. And when he sees that third army coming, he says, I can't afford to win another battle. I win these battles, but each time I lose some of my troops, and I can't replace them. And the Romans just keep sprouting new armies. So he gives up and goes home. So Rome kind of loses every battle, but wins the war. And Pyrrhus, one of his actually his officers, has a great line as they're kind of going back to Greece. He says, fighting the Romans is like fighting a hydra. And a hydra is this mythological monster that when you cut off one head, two more grow in its place. So you can just never win.
That's fascinating.
So that's the secret to Rome's early success.
It's not the military strategy. It's not some technological asymmetry of power. It's literally just manpower.
Mm-hmm. Early on.
Early on.
And later, the Romans get very good when we're into the empire phase now. So once they have emperors into the AD era of kind of doing the same thing by drawing in the best and the brightest and the most ambitious and the most talented local leaders of the people they conquer. So when they go someplace, let's say they conquer a tribe of what to them is barbarians, they'll often take the sons of the barbarian chiefs, bring them to Rome and raise them as Romans.
Damn.
And so it's that whole way of kind of turning your enemies into your own strength. And the Romans start giving citizenship to areas they conquer. So once they move out of Italy, they aren't as free with the citizenship, but eventually they do. So they make Spain, lost cities in Spain, they make all citizens and other places. And soon enough, the Roman emperors and the Roman senators are not Italians. They're coming from Spain or North Africa or Germany or wherever. So, as early as the 2nd century AD of the Roman Empire. So the first set of emperors, the first 100 years were all Italians. But right away at the beginning of the 2nd century AD, you have Trajan, who's from Spain. And the next guy, Hadrian's from Spain. And then a century later, you have Septimius Severus, who's from North Africa. You later get guys from Syria. So, the actual leaders of the Roman Empire are coming from the provinces.
That's
and
brilliant.
It's that openness to incorporating foreigners, making them work for you, making them want to be part of your empire that I think is one of Rome's strengths.
Yeah, taking the sons is a brilliant idea and bringing them to Rome. Because it's a kind of generational integration.
And the Roman military later in the empire is this giant machine of 500,000 people that takes in foreigners and churns out Romans. So the army is composed of two groups. You have the Roman legionaries, who are all citizens. But then you have another group that's just as large, so about 250,000 of each, 250,000 legionaries, 250,000 of the second group called auxiliaries. And auxiliaries tend to be newly conquered warlike people that the Romans enlist as auxiliaries to fight with them. And they serve side by side with the Roman legions for 25 years. And at the end of that time, when they're discharged, what do they get? They get Roman citizenship. And their kids then tend to become Roman legionaries. So again, you're taking the most warlike and potentially dangerous of your enemies, kind of absorbing them, putting through this thing for 25 years where they learn Latin, they learn Roman customs, they maybe marry someone who's already a Roman or a Latin woman. They have kids within the system. Their kids become Roman legionaries, and you've thoroughly integrated what could have been your biggest enemies, right? Your greatest threat.
That's just brilliant process of integration. Is that what explains the rapid expansion during the late Republic?
No. So there it's more the indigenous Italians who are in the army at that point. They haven't really expanded the auxiliaries yet. That's more something that happens in the empire. So so back it up. So we have that first 250 years of the Roman Republic. Yes. So from about 500 to, let's say, 250 BC. And in that period, they gradually expand throughout Italy, conquer the other Italian cities who are pretty much like them. So they're people who already speak similar languages or the same language, have the same gods. It's easy to integrate them. That's the ones they make the half citizens and allies. Then in the second half of that period, from about 250 to let's say 30 BC, Rome goes outside of Italy. And this is a new world because now they're encountering people who are really fundamentally different. So true others. They do not have the same gods. They don't speak the same language. They have fundamentally different systems of economy, everything. And Rome first expands in the Western Mediterranean. And there, their big rival is the city-state of Carthage, which is another city founded almost the same time as Rome that has also been a young, vigorously expanding, aggressive empire. So in the Western Empire at this time, you have two sort of rival groups, and they're very different because the Romans are these citizen soldier farmers. So the Romans are all these small farmers. That's the basis of their economy, and it's the Romans who serve in the army. So the person who is a citizen is also really by main profession a farmer, and then in times of war he becomes a soldier. Carthage is an oligarchy of merchants. So it's a very small citizen body. They make their money through maritime trade. So they have ships that go all over the Mediterranean. They don't have a large army of Carthaginians. Instead, they hire mercenaries mostly to fight for them. So it's almost these two rival systems. You know, it's different philosophies, different economies, everything. Rome is strong on land, Carthage is strong at sea. So there's this dichotomy. But they're both looking to expand, and they repeatedly come into conflict as they expand. So Carthage is on the coast of North Africa, Rome's in central Italy. What's right between them? The island of Sicily. So the first big war is fought purely dictated by geography. Who gets Sicily? Rome or Carthage? And Rome wins in the end. They get it. But Carthage is still strong. They're not weakened. So Carthage is now looking to expand. The next place to go is Spain. So they go and take Spain. Rome, meanwhile, is moving along the coast of what today is France. Where are they going to meet up? On the border of Spain and France. And there's a city at that point, at this point in time, called Saguntum. The second big war between Rome and Carthage is over. Who gets Saguntum? So, I mean, you can just look at a map and see this stuff coming. Sometimes geography is inevitability. And I think in the course of the wars between Rome and Carthage, called the Punic Wars, there is this geographic inevitability to them.
Can you speak to the Punic Wars? Why was there's so many levels on which we can talk about this, but why was Rome victorious?
Well, the Punic Wars really almost always comes down to the second Punic War. There's three. There's three Punic Wars. The first is over Sicily. Rome wins. The second is the big one. And it's the big one because Carthage at this point in time, just by sheer luck, coughs up one of the greatest military geniuses in all of history, this guy Hannibal Barca. He was actually the son of the Carthaginian general who fought Rome for Sicily. Hamilcar was his father. But Hannibal is this just genius, just absolute military genius. He goes to Spain. He's the one who kind of organizes stuff there. And now he knows the second war with Rome is inevitable. And so the question is, how do you take down Rome? He's smart. He's seen Rome's strength. He knows it's the Italian allies. So Rome always wins because even if they lose battles, they go to the Italian allies and half-citizens and raise new armies. So how do you beat them? He can never raise that many troops himself. And Hannibal, I think correctly, figures out the one way to maybe defeat Rome is to cut them away from their allies. Well, how do you do this? Hannibal's plan is, I'm not going to wait and fight the Romans in Spain or North Africa. I'm going to invade Italy. So I'm going to strike at the heart of this growing Roman Empire. And my hope is that if I can win a couple big battles against Rome in Italy, the Italians will want their freedom back. And they'll rebel from Rome and maybe even join me. Because most people who have been conquered want their freedom back. So this is a reasonable plan. So Hannibal famously crosses the Alps with elephants, dramatic stuff. Nobody expects him to do this. Nobody thinks you can do this. Shows up in northern Italy. Romans send an army. Hannibal massacres them. He is a military genius. Rome takes a year, raises a second army. We know this story. Sends it against Hannibal. Hannibal wipes him out. Rome gets clever this time. They say, okay, Hannibal's different. we're going to take 2 years, raise 2 armies, and send them both out at the same time against Hannibal. So they do this, and this is the Battle of Cannae, which is one of the most famous battles in history. Hannibal is facing this army of 80,000 Romans about, and he comes up with a strategy called double envelopment. I mean, we can go into it later if you want, but it's this famous strategy where he basically kind of sucks the Romans in, surrounds them on all sides, and in one afternoon at the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal kills about 60,000 Romans. Now, just to put that in perspective, that's more Romans hacked to death in one afternoon with swords than Americans died in 20 years in Vietnam. I mean, the Battle of Gettysburg, which lasted 3 days and was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, I think the actual deaths at that were maybe like 15,000. So this is bloodshed of an almost unimaginable scale.
It's also brutal.
Yes.
Just the
I mean,
slaughter.
it's just mind-boggling to think of that. So now this is Rome's darkest hour. This is why the Second Punic War is important, because there's that, Nietzsche phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. This is the closest Rome comes to death in the history of the Republic. Hannibal almost kills Rome. But no, it's not much of a spoiler. Rome's going to survive, and from this point on, they're going to be unbeatable. But this is the crisis. This is the crucible. This is the furnace that Rome passes through that is the dividing point between when they're one more up-and-coming empire and when they're clearly the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. So what do they do about Hannibal? Well, they're smart. We're not going to fight Hannibal. We're not going to give Hannibal the chance to kill more Romans. So they adopt a strategy that they'll follow Hannibal, or they raise a couple more armies, follow Hannibal around, but whenever Hannibal turns and tries to attack them, the Romans just back off. No, thank you. We're not going to give you a chance. Meanwhile, though, they're not scared of other Carthaginians. So they raise a couple more armies and they send these to Spain, for example, and start attacking the Carthaginian holdings there. And by luck or necessity, Rome comes up with its own brilliant commander at this point, a guy named Scipio. And he wins victories in Spain, conquers Spain. Then he crosses into North Africa and starts to conquer that and ends up threatening Carthage directly. And poor Hannibal, undefeated in Italy, has now been walking up and down Italy, or marching up and down Italy, for 12 years looking for another fight. And the Romans won't give it to him. Mm-hmm. They've been attacking all these other areas and chipping away at Carthaginian power. So finally, after more than a decade in Italy, Hannibal is called back to defend the homeland, defend Carthage from Scipio. The two meet in a big battle. This should be one of the great battles of all time. It's the Battle of Zama, but, Hannibal's guys are kind of old by this point. Scipio has all the advantages. He wins. Carthage is defeated. So that's pretty much the end of Carthage. The city survives, and then 50 years later, the Romans wipe it out, but that's not much of a war. But from this moment on, from the Second Punic War, which ends in 201 BC, Rome is undisputably the most powerful nation in the Mediterranean world. And having conquered the West, they're now going to turn to the East, which is the Greek world. And the Greek world is older, it's richer, it's the rich part, half of the Mediterranean, it's culturally more sophisticated, it's the world left by Alexander the Great that's ruled by the descendants of his generals. And the Greeks kind of view themselves as superior to the Romans. I mean, to the Greeks, the Romans are these uncouth, sort of savage barbarians. Mm-hmm. But they're going to get a real shock because the Roman army now has gotten really good to beat Hannibal. And when they go east, they're going to just defeat the Greeks relatively easily, one after the other. And there's a famous historian named Polybius, who is a Greek whose city was captured by the Romans. He later becomes a friend to the Scipio family. Mm-hmm. He actually teaches some of the Scipio children about Greek culture. And he writes a history of Rome. And his motivation for writing this is, he says at the beginning of this book, he says, surely there can be no one so incurious as to not want to understand how the Romans could have conquered the entire Greek world in 53 years, because that seems unimaginable to him. So he's writing this entire history as a way to try and understand, how did the Romans do it? We were these wonderful, superior people, and they came around in 50 years, bang, that's the end of us. So that's his motivation.
Could you maybe speak to any interesting details of the military genius of Hannibal or Scipio? At that time, what are some interesting aspects of this double envelopment idea?
I mean, Hannibal is good because he understood how to use different troop types and to play to their strengths and how to use terrain. So, I mean, this is basic military stuff, but he did it really well. So, one of his victories against the Romans, for example, is when the Romans are marching along the edge of a lake and their army is strung out in marching formations. They're not kind of in combat formation, but they're strung out along the edge of this lake. It's misty, there's not good visibility, and he ambushes them along this lakeside. So, Lake Trasimene. And it's just using the terrain, understanding this. Again, Hannibal is very much outnumbered, but he's able to use the terrain and to take the enemy by surprise. At Cannae, he's working against the expectations. So the traditional thing you do in the ancient world is the two armies would line up on opposite sides of a field. You'd put your best troops in the middle, you'd put your cavalry on the sides, you'd put your lightly armed skirmishers beyond those. And then the two sides kind of smack together, and the good troops fight the good troops, and you see who wins. Now, Hannibal is hugely outnumbered by this giant phalanx of heavy infantry, which is what the Romans specialized in. They're very good at sort of heavily armed foot soldiers. So he knows, I don't want to go up against that. I don't have that many of that troop type. My guys aren't as good as the Romans anyway. So he lines up some of his less good troops in the center against the big menacing Roman phalanx, and he tells them, okay, when the Romans come, you're not really trying to win. Just hold them up, just delay them. And even tells them you can give ground. So you can retreat and sort of let the line form a big kind of C-shaped crescent. Let the Romans sort of advance into you, but just hold that line. And meanwhile, he puts his cavalry and his good troops on the side. And so on the sides, those good troops defeat the Romans, and then they kind of circle in behind the Romans and attack that big menacing Roman phalanx from the rear where it's very vulnerable. And so Hannibal catches the Romans in this sort of giant cauldron, just with people closing in from both sides. And they get pressed together. They can't fight properly. They panic, and they're all slaughtered. And that strategy of double envelopment, of sort of going around both sides, becomes the model for all kinds of military strategies throughout the rest of history. I mean, the Germans used this in their Blitzkrieg in World War II. A lot of it was kind of that, go around the sides and envelop the enemy. On the Eastern Front, they had a bunch of these sort of cauldron battles where they would go around and try to encircle huge chunks of the Russian army and do the same thing. Supposedly, even in the Gulf War, it was part of the U.S. strategy for the invasion of Iraq to do this kind of double envelopment maneuver. So it's something that for the rest of military history has been an inspiration to other armies.
Can you speak to maybe the difference between heavy infantry and cavalry, the usefulness of it in the ancient world?
The ancient world, sort of from the Greeks through the Romans, there's this consistent line of focusing on heavy infantry. So going back to Greece, when they're fighting, let's say, Persia, which at the time was the superpower of the ancient world and vastly richer, vastly larger than ancient Greece, tons more men. But the Persians tended to be archers, tended to be light horsemen, tended to be light infantry, whereas the Greeks specialized in what are called hoplites, which is a kind of infantrymen with very heavy body armor, a helmet, a spear, and a really big, heavy shield. And they would get in that formation where you kind of make the shields overlap and just form this solid mass bristling with spear points and just slowly kind of march forward and grind up your enemy in front of you. And so that's that sort of block of heavy infantry. The advantages head on against other things, they tend to win. The disadvantages, it's slow moving. It's vulnerable from the sides and the rear, so you got to protect those. But if you can keep frontally faced, it's pretty much invincible. And that's taken even further by Alexander the Great, who comes up with the idea, well, what if we even give them a longer spear? So Greek spears were 6 to 8 feet long. Alexander the Great arms his armies with the sarissa, which is this 15-foot almost a pike, this extra long spear. And so when the spear is that long, you don't even hardly need the shields anymore. So it's just this incredibly powerful thing in frontal attack. And that's what he uses to make himself ruler of the known world. He goes and conquers the Persian Empire and makes himself the Persian King of Kings with this phalanx of troops armed with the sarissa. So that's very powerful. The Romans go a little bit different route. They have heavy infantry, but they focus more on fighting with short swords. So it's get up close and kind of stab. And the other thing the Romans do is they focus on flexibility and subdividing their army. So Alexander's phalanx was a mass of, let's say, 5,000 guys, and it was one unit. The Roman army is organized in an ever decreasing number of subunits. So you have a group of 8 guys who are a contubernia, the men who share a tent. You take 10 of those and they form a century of 80 men. You take a bunch of those and you form a cohort. If you get a bunch of those, you form a legion. So the Romans are able to subdivide their army. And the big sticking point comes at 197 BC at the Battle of Cynocephalae, when the Roman legion goes up against one of the descendants of Alexander the Great who's using his military system. So this is the new Roman system with flexibility versus the old invincible Alexander system with the heavily armed sarissa with those long 15-foot poles. And the key moment in the battle is where they lock together, and in a head-on clash, the Macedonians are going to win. But the Romans have the flexibility to break off a little section of their army, run around to the side, and attack that formation from the side, and they win the battle. So they prove tactically superior because of their flexibility. So it's always development and counter-development in military history.
A fascinating, brutal testing ground of tactics and technology.
Adaptation. You have to keep adapting. That's, I think, the key thing.
One of the fascinating things about your work, you study Roman life in the ancient world, but also the details, like we mentioned. You are an expert in armor. So what kind of, maybe you could speak to weapons and most importantly, armor that were used by the Romans or by people in the ancient world?
I do military history. So, I mean, the Romans specialized in, early on, they have pretty random armor and it's not standardized. I mean, remember, there's no factories in the ancient world. So nobody's cranking out 10,000 units of exactly the same armor. Each one is handmade. Now, there can be a degree of standardization. Even as early as Alexander, there was a certain amount of standardization, but each one is still handmade, and that's important to keep in mind, each weapon, each piece of armor. Armor develops over time to fit the tactics. So the Greek hoplites are very heavy armor. The Roman infantrymen early in the Republic is lighter. Eventually they get this typical sort of, chainmail shirt, helmet, shield. The classic sort of Roman legionary, I would say, is the one of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, so the early Roman Empire. And this is the guy who wore bands of steel arranged in sort of bands around their body. So it looks almost like a lobster's shell, right? And this is a thing called the lorica segmentata. So it's solid steel, which is very good protection, but it's flexible because it has these individual bands that provide a lot of movement. And then you have a helmet, you have a square shield that's kind of curved, and you have the short sword, the Roman gladius. And that's kind of the classic Roman legionary. Later, more things develop. My personal sort of relationship with armor is I got really by accident involved in this project to try to reconstruct this mysterious type of armor that was used especially by the Greeks and Alexander the Great called the linothorax, which apparently was made only out of linen and glue. Mm-hmm. So this seems a little odd that, that's not the sort of material once you want metal or something. But we had clear literary references that people, including Alexander, and the most famous image of Alexander is this Alexander mosaic found at Pompeii that shows him wearing one of these funny types of armor. The catch is none survived. It's organic materials. Mm-hmm. So we don't have any of them. And archaeologists like to study things that survive. So we have nice typologies of Greek armor made of bronze, Roman armor made of steel or sort of proto-steel. But this thing, this linothorax, was a mystery. And one of my undergraduate students, a guy named Scott Bartell, had a real Well, an Alexander obsession. He really loved Alexander.
As one should.
He had Alexandros tattooed on his arm in Greek. And he was a smart student. He was really smart. And so he one summer made himself an imitation of this thing of Alexander's just for fun. And he said, can you give me some articles so I could do a better job? So I some scholarly articles about this armor. And with typical sort of, academic arrogance, I said, why, Scott, of course I will. I'll give you some references. And I went and looked and there weren't any. So at that point I was like, tell you what, why don't you and I look into this and try to do a reconstruction using only the materials they would have had in the ancient world? And little did I know at the time, I thought maybe I'll get an article out of this. I mean, it ended up being a 10-year project involving, 150 students, a couple dozen other faculty members, ended up having 3 documentaries made out of it. And Scott and I ended up writing a scholarly book on this. So this is how, you never know where your next project's going to come from. So it started with this undergraduate, turned into this huge thing. But it's what we did. We first said, all right, what are all the sources for this armor? And in the end, we found 65 accounts of it in ancient literature by 40 different authors. So we have literary descriptions. And then we looked at ancient art, and we were able to identify about 1,000 images in ancient art in vase paintings, pottery, bronze sculpture, tomb paintings, all these different things showing this armor. And then using those 2 things, we tried to backwards engineer a pattern to say, well, if this is what the end product looked like, what does it have to look like when you make it? And then we tried to reconstruct one of these things using only the glue and materials. So we had to use, animal glues, rabbit glue. We had to end up sort of making our own linen, which comes from the flax plant. So we had to grow flax, harvest it, using only techniques in the ancient world. So modern flax goes through chemical processes. No, we had to do this the old-fashioned way, spin it into thread, so the thread into fabric, glue it all together. And then the fun part was, once we made these things, we subjected them to ballistics testing. So we shot them with arrows, which again were wooden reconstruction arrows using bronze arrowheads that were based on arrowheads found on ancient battlefields to determine how good protection would this thing have been. And of course, the kind of fun one that everyone always likes and that the documentaries always want is at one point they're like, well, can you put Scott in one of these and shoot him?
Yeah.
And we're like, okay. I mean, at that point, we'd done about 1,000 test shots. I grew up shooting bows and arrows. I knew exactly how far that was going to go. So it's one of these, don't do this at home, kids.
So there's a million questions to ask here, but, in general, how well, in terms of ballistics, does it work? Like, can it withstand arrows or direct strikes from like swords and axes and stuff like that?
Bottom line is a 1 centimeter thick linothorax. So laminated or even sewn, it doesn't have to be laminated, layer of linen is about as good protection as 2 millimeters of bronze, which was the thickest comparable body armor of bronze at the time. And we're talking 4th century, 5th century BC here. So classical and Hellenistic Greece. And that would have protected you from, let's say, random arrow strikes on the battlefield. So you could have gotten hit by arrows and they simply wouldn't have gone through.
What are the benefits? So is there a major weight difference?
Yes. So the benefits of this are it's much lighter than metal armor. So the linothorax is about 11 pounds. A bronze cuirass of comparable protection would have been about 24 to 6 pounds. A chainmail shirt would be about 28, 27 pounds. It's cooler. I mean, the Mediterranean's a hot place with the hot sun. Even today, a linen shirt is something you wear when you want to be cool. So it's much lighter. That gives your troops greater endurance on the battlefield. They can run farther, fight longer. It's cheaper. You don't need a blacksmith who's a specialist to make it. In fact, probably, this is interesting, any woman in the ancient world could have made one of these because they were the ones who spun thread and sewed it into fabric. So I can easily see in a household, a mother making this for her son, a wife making it for her husband. So it's a form of armor you could have made domestically that would have been, maybe not the greatest armor, but pretty good, pretty comparable to bronze armor.
And it's amazing that you used all the materials they had at the time and none of the modern techniques. But I should probably say, maybe you can speak to that, they were probably much better at doing that than you are, right? Because like, again, generational. It's a skill. And it's a skill that probably is practiced across decades, across centuries.
I mean, in terms of producing the fabric, I'm sure they could do it 10 times faster than we could. Just that's a speed thing. But it's still incredibly labor intensive. Where I think there's a big difference between our reconstruction and ancient ones is in the glue. So we ended up using a kind of least common denominator glue. We used rabbit glue because it would have been available anywhere and it's cheap. But in the ancient world, they did have basically the equivalent of super glues. I mean, we found, for example, helmets that were fished out of a river in Germany that were had metal parts glued together that after 2,000 years of immersion in water were still glued together. So they had some great glues. We just don't know what the recipes for them were. So we went the opposite tack and said, well, we're just going to make something that we know they could have made. So it was at least this good. You know what I'm saying?
But actually, this is a materials thing, but I think glue, aside from helping glue things together, it can also be a thing that serves as armor. So like if you glue things correctly, the way it permeates the material that it's gluing can strengthen the material, the integrity of the material. That's an art and a science probably that they understood deeply.
The process of lamination did add something. So there's actually a huge debate among scholars and actually a sort of amateur archaeologist that was this linothorax thing glued together, or was it simply sewn together? Was it composite, partially linen, partially leather, or other materials? And my honest answer is, I think it's all of the above. Because again, every piece of armor in the ancient world was an individual creation. So I think if you had some spare leather, you put that in. If you wanted to make one that was just sewn together, or even quilted, stuffed with stuff, you do that. Maybe you were good at gluing stuff, you use that. So I think there's no one answer. We investigated one possibility because we just had limited time and money and resources. But I think all these other things existed at the same time and were variants of it.
Just as a small aside, I just think this is a fascinating journey you went on. I love it. Sort of answering really important questions about, in this case, armor, about military equipment and technology that archaeologists can't answer by using all the sources you can to understand what it looked like, what were the materials, using the materials at the time, and actually doing ballistic testing. It's really cool. It's really cool that you see that there's a hole in the literature. Yeah. Nobody studied it, and going hard and doing it the right way to sort of uncover this. I don't know. I think it's an amazing mystery about the ancient world.
I mean, shifting from just sort of Roman history in general to my research that I've done as a scholar, the theme that runs throughout my scholarship is practical stuff. Yeah. I'm interested, how did this actually work in the ancient world? So there's people who are much more theoretical, who look at, the symbolic meaning of something. I'm simpler. I just want to know, how did this work? So almost all of my books that I've written have started with some just, how did something work? And I'm trying to just figure out that aspect of it. And that's just, maybe it's a personality thing. I also have kind of a science-y background. So I think I've used a lot of that, even though I'm a humanist and a historian, I use a lot of kind of hard science in my work. I did a book on floods where I had to get really heavy into, vectors of disease and, hydraulics and engineering and all that stuff. And I think, again, having that sort of hard science combined with a humanist background helps with those sorts of projects.
Well, like you said, I think the details help you understand deeply the big picture of history. And I mean, Alexander the Great wore this thing.
Yeah.
So this is,
and I should say, by the way, it does drop out of use around Roman times. And I think what's going on there is technology. That with bronze, it's hard to keep a sharp edge on things. But once you get into metals which approximate steel, you can get sharper. And a key factor to penetrating fabric is the edge on the arrowhead, right? So as soon as you start to get something more like a razor edge, it's going to go through it more easily. Also, there's changes in the bows that are being used. You start to get sort of Eastern horse archers showing up with composite bows, which are much more powerful. And so it just becomes outdated as frontline military equipment. What's interesting is by the Roman period, people are still wearing it, but it's now things like when I go hunting, if I'm hunting lions, I wear this. There's an actual source that says it's really good for hunting dangerous big cats because it catches their teeth and stops them from penetrating. One emperor wears one of these under his toga. It's kind of like a not bulletproof vest, but stab-proof vest. So again, it's not to fight in the front line of the legions, but it'll protect him from somebody trying to assassinate him. So it still has those uses where you're not up against top-line military equipment.
To honor the aforementioned undergraduate student who loves Alexander the Great, we must absolutely talk about Alexander the Great for a little bit. Why was he successful, do you think, as a conqueror? Probably one of the greatest conquerors in the history of humanity.
Yeah, and I mean that is then one of the greatest heroes or one of the greatest villains in humanity too. It's like Julius Caesar. He's famous for conquering Gaul. Well, about 1 million people were killed and 1 million enslaved in that. So does it make him a horrible person or one of our heroes? But Alexander is a combination of two things. One is he really just was a skilled individual. And he was one of those guys who had it all. He was smart, he was athletic, and he was supremely charismatic. I mean, it's obviously one of these people that would walk into a room and everyone just kind of gravitates to him. He had that magic that made him an effective leader. And secondly, he was lucky because it wasn't all him. He inherited a system created by his father, Philip II. So he was in the right time at the right place and had this instrument placed in his hands, and then he had the intelligence and the charisma to go use it. So it's one of these coming together of different things. But often his father's contribution, I think, is not recognized as much as it is. It's his father who reformed the Macedonian army, who came up with that system of equipping them with the sarissa, this extra long spear that made them really effective, created the mixed army. So one of the keys to Alexander's success as in a tactical sense is that his army was composed of different elements: heavy cavalry, heavy infantry, light infantry, missile troops. And he understands that he can use these in different and flexible ways on the battlefield. Whereas a lot of warfare before then had just been you line up, two sides smashed together. So he did clever things with this army that was a better tool than others did. And then he was just supremely ambitious. I mean, he cared about his fame, which I guess is ego, but he clearly cared about that more than he did about things like money. He was indifferent to that. And he did have a grand vision. So he did have this vision of trying to unite the world both politically under his control, but also culturally. And this is an interesting thing. So he was very open, in fact, insistent of trying to meld together the best elements of all the different cultures. So he himself was a Macedonian, but he admired Greek culture, so he pretty much adopted Greek culture as his own. When he conquers Persia, he starts adapting elements of Persian culture. He dresses in Persian clothing. He marries a Persian woman. He sort of forces thousands of his troops to marry local women. He appoints Persians to positions of power. He integrates Persian units into his military. He really wanted to fuse all these things together. And some people see this as a very enlightened vision that, oh, he's not just, I want to conquer people and now they're my slaves. That he was really trying to create this one culture that was sort of the best of everything. Others see it, of course, as a form of cultural imperialism. You're destroying other cultures and trying to warp or twist them into something. But what I think is interesting is that this vision he had of uniting cultures creates very problematic tensions among his own followers, because the Macedonians, his original troops, did not like this on the whole. They wanted the old model where we conquer you, you're our slaves. We don't want to share stuff with you. We don't want you joining us in the army. We don't want you appointed to positions of power. We're your conquerors, and that's it. And so Alexander had to deal with a lot of friction from his own oldest, most loyal elements at the way he was being, in their eyes, too generous to the conquered. So Alexander is one of these interesting personalities because every generation sees him in a new light and focuses on different things. So for some, he's this enlightened visionary who was taught by Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, and they say, well, this influenced him. Others see him as an egomaniacal warmonger, just I'm out to kill and gain glory. There was a book a couple decades ago that says, oh, he's just an alcoholic, which he probably was, yeah. So you get all these competing images, and the great thing is, we don't really know what the true Alexander was or what his motivations were. It's a mixed message.
Why do you think the Roman Empire lasted? while the Greek Empire, as the Alexander expanded, did not.
That's a clear answer. So Alexander's empire fragmented the moment he died. And so his empire was all about personal loyalty. It was his charisma holding it together, his personality. And he completely failed to create a structure so that it would continue after his death. And of course, he died young. He didn't think he would die when he did, but still, you should put something in place. So his was a flash in the pan. He had this spectacular conquest. In 10 years, he conquered what was then most of the known world, but he had no permanent structure in place. He didn't really deal with the issue of succession. It fell apart instantly. The Romans are much more about building a structure. So, I mean, as we've talked about a little, they were very good about incorporating the people they conquered into the Roman project. I mean, they're oppressive, they're imperialistic as well. Let's not whitewash them. I mean, they had moments when they would just wipe out entire cities. But on the whole, they were much more about trying to bring people into the Roman world. And I think that was one of their strengths, is that they were open to integration and bringing in different people to keep rejuvenating themselves.
One of the most influential developments from the Roman Republic was their legal system. And as you mentioned, it's one of the things that still lasted to this day in many of its elements. So it started with the 12 tables in 451 BC. Can you just speak to this legal system and the 12 tables?
Yeah, I mean, Roman law is one of their most significant, maybe the most significant legacy they have on the modern world. So, I mean, just to start at that end of it, something like, 90% of the world uses a legal system which is either directly or indirectly derived from the Roman one. So even countries that you wouldn't think are really using Roman law kind of are, because all the terminology, all that comes from Roman law. And the Romans, their first law code was this thing, the 12 tables. So this is way back in the Middle Republic, and it was a typical early law code. So most of the stuff it concerns are agricultural concerns. So if I have a tree and its fruit drops onto your property, who owns the fruit? Yeah. If my cow wanders into your field and eats your grain, am I responsible? I mean, I love these early law codes that are all about this like farmer problems, But law codes are hugely important because you need a law code to enable people to live in groups. Mm-hmm. So they're the transitional thing that lets human beings live together without just resorting to anarchy. And most of the early law codes are agricultural, like Hammurabi's code in Mesopotamia. Most of them are retaliatory, meaning eye for an eye type justice. So you do something to me, it gets done to you. But they're this necessary precondition for civilization, I would say. And the 12 tables is that. It's a crude law code. It has a lot of goofy stuff in it. It has things about, if you use magic, this is the punishment. But it's that basic agrarian society law code. Now, that's typical of many societies. Where the Romans are different is they keep going. They keep developing their law code. And by the late Republic, the Romans just get kind of really into legal stuff. I don't know why, but and the Romans are very methodical, organized people, so maybe this has something to do with it. But their law code just keeps getting more and more complicated and keeps expanding to different areas. And they start to get jurists who write sort of theoretical things about Roman law. And eventually it becomes this huge body both of cases and comments on those cases and of actual laws. And in the 6th century AD, so the 500s, the Roman Emperor Justinian, who is a emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire by this point, the Byzantine Empire, compiles all this together into something that today we just kind of loosely call Justinian's Code of Roman Law, and that survives. And so that becomes the basis for almost all the legal systems around the world. And it's very complicated. And Roman law, I think, is really fun because on the one hand, it's really dry, but it also preserves these wonderful little vignettes of daily life. So you get these great, just kind of entertaining law cases. One of my favorite, and this may not even be a real case, this might be a hypothetical that they would use like to train Roman sort of, law students, is like one day a man sends his slave to the barber to get a shave. And the barber shop is adjacent to an athletic field. And two guys are on the athletic field throwing a ball back and forth. And one of them throws the ball badly. The other guy fails to catch it. The ball flies into the barber shop, hits the hand of the barber, cuts the slave's throat. He dies. Who's liable under Roman law? Is it the athlete 1 who threw the ball badly? Is it athlete 2 who failed to catch it? Is the barber who actually cut the slave's throat? Is it the owner of the slave for being stupid enough to send his slave to get a shave in a place adjacent to a playing field? Or is it the Roman state for zoning a barber shop next to an athletic field? What do you think?
Well, do they resolve the complexity of that with a right answer?
We don't have the answer.
We don't have the answer.
It's a case without the answer. So we have various jurists commenting on this one, but we don't have what was actually ruled. But it's just a great little, sort of vignette. And that's how complicated Roman law got, that it was dealing with these weird esoteric questions. There's another one where, a cow gets loose and runs into an apartment building, goes up onto the roof and crashes down 3 stories into a bar on the ground floor and kicks open the taps to the wine jug and all the wine flows out. Who's at fault? I mean, this seems to have happened, as crazy as it sounds. And Roman testamentary law is great. I mean, something like 20% of Roman law has to do with wills and what you do with a will and what makes a will valid. You have to have 7 witnesses, and you have to have a guy named a Liebeprens to witness it, and the witnesses have to be adult men who can't be blind, and all this other stuff. So it's just great. I mean, it's fun to mess around in this, but it always contains these little nuggets about what happens. I mentioned I wrote a book on floods, and there were all these law cases about if a flood strikes the city and picks up my piece of furniture in my apartment building and carries it out the door and deposits it in another apartment building, does that guy now own my furniture because it's now legally within his apartment? Or can I go in there and repossess it because the flood took it out of my apartment? This is the stuff laws handle, and that's how sophisticated Roman law got.
Did kind of corrupt, unfair things seep into the law?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's biased in favor of the wealthy, obviously. And I mean, Roman law cases are interesting because they became linked to politics. So one of the way that politicians, up-and-coming politicians, aspiring politicians could sort of make their name or become famous was by either prosecuting or defending people in Roman law courts. And especially during the late Roman Republic, you get a lot of really sensational, what today we would call celebrity law cases. So this is where some of the biggest politicians were accused of very melodramatic kinds of things. I mean, the most famous Roman orator of all time, Cicero, is a guy who made his entire career in the law courts. And that's how he made his reputation, was able to parlay that into political power, and eventually was elected to the highest office in the Roman government. But it's purely because of his skill, his facility at using words, at giving speeches in public.
So they loved the puzzle and the game of law, the sort of untangling really complicated legal situations and coming up with new laws that help you tangle and untangle the situations.
And law cases, again, especially in the late Republic, also became a form of public spectacle.
Right.
So Rome did not have law courts in a building locked away. A lot of these cases were held in the Roman Forum, in the open, and audiences would just come to be entertained. And the people presenting the speeches there were playing as much to this audience as they were to, let's say, the jury or a judge. And that became a big part of the cases. So that's all tied up in Roman oratory.
So
too.
We're talking a bit about the details of the laws. Is there some big picture laws that are new innovations or like profound things like all Roman citizens are equal before the law, kind of founding fathers type of in the United States, in the Western world, these big legal ideas?
I think maybe one of the things that was really stressed in Roman law early on, even as early as the 12 Tables, is the notion of Roman citizenship. So if you were a Roman citizen, it came with a set of both privileges and obligations. So the obligations were you're supposed to fight in the army, you were supposed to vote in elections. The privileges were you had the protection of Roman law, and at least in theory, if not in practice, everybody was equal under that law. Now, of course, keep in mind we're talking about men here. And even at the height of the Roman Empire, so let's say 2nd century AD, there were about 50 million human beings living within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. Maybe 6 million were actual citizens. So, this is, we tend to go, oh, it's so great. If you're a citizen, you have all these things. Well, adult free men who are not slaves, who are not resident foreigners, they have this great stuff. And that's always a tiny minority of all the human beings who existed in this society. But still, the notion of citizenship is huge. And citizens, for example, early on, you had to be tried at Rome if you were accused of something. And there's this very famous moment in Sicily where an abusive governor who's corrupt is punishing a citizen arbitrarily. And this person cries out, "Civis Romanus sum," meaning I am a Roman citizen. And it really was this hugely loaded statement that gives me protections. It is wrong for you to do this to me. It's wrong for you to beat me because I am a citizen and that gives me certain protections. So that notion of citizenship is something that I think the Romans really emphasized and becomes a legacy to a lot of civilizations today where citizenship means something. It's a special status.
So you mentioned slavery. That's something that is common throughout human history. What do we know about their relationship with slavery?
Well, Roman slavery, a couple just reminders at the beginning. First of all, it's not racial slavery. So for people, in the United States, you tend to think of slavery through this kind of racial lens. So slaves in ancient Roman society could be any color, ethnicity, gender, origin, whatever. It's an economic status. Now, having said that, slavery is fundamentally horrific to human dignity because it is defining a human being as an object. And very famously, a Roman agricultural writer who's writing about farms, just as a kind of aside, says, on your farm, you have three types of tools. You have dumb tools, and by dumb he means can't speak. So that's like shovels, picks, things like this, wagons. You have semi-articulate tools, which are animals, and you have articulate tools, which are human beings, slaves. And for him, these are all just categories of tools. It's so intensely dehumanizing to view people in that way. Mm-hmm. So Roman slavery is odd in that it doesn't have this racial component. It's horrible in the way all slavery is horrible. But the other thing about it is it's not a hard line. It's a permeable membrane, and many people move back and forth across it. So you have many people in the Roman world who were born a slave who gained their freedom through one means or another. And you have many others who were born free and become slaves. And you have some who go back and forth. There's a great Roman tombstone of this guy who says, I was born a free man in Parthia, I was enslaved, then I gained my freedom and I became a teacher or something, and I had a life, and now I'm a Roman citizen. So it's this whole back and forth across all these boundaries multiple times.
Oh, so there's probably a process, like an economic transaction.
The most common source of slaves in the Roman world was war. So wherever the Roman army went, in its wake would be literally a train of slave traders. So you're in war, you capture an enemy city, you whack the people over the head, and you turn around if you're a soldier and you sell them to one of these slave traders that's following the army around, literally. So that's probably the biggest source of slaves. Another big source is just children of slaves or slaves. And some people could literally sell either themselves or their children into slavery due to economic, necessity or privation or something. So as terrible as that sounds, a father could sell a child if he needed money. Once you were a slave, though, the experience of slavery varied a lot because a lot of the slaves were agricultural slaves. So they would work sort of like in the American South, big plantations. They might be chained. They were probably abused. That's very similar to slavery as we think of it in, let's say the Caribbean, South America, or the United States prior to the Civil War, that kind of slavery. But a lot of Roman slaves were also some of the more skilled people. And this seems a little weird. So if you're a rich person, you have slaves, it's actually a good investment for you to train your slaves in a profession. So a lot of Roman doctors, scribes, accountants, sort of, all this sort of thing, barbers were slaves. Because if you train this person and then they produce a lot of money for you, you get that money. And those slaves would sometimes be given an incentive to work hard where they could and this is just sort of an agreement between the master and the slave, if they earned a certain amount of money, X amount of money, they could then buy their own freedom from the master. So this was your incentive to work harder. If you were trained, let's say, as a doctor, I work really hard, I can buy myself out of slavery. Or a lot of masters would free their slaves in their wills. So when they died, they would say, I manumit this slave and that slave. So it was a weird institution in that elements were just as horrible as what we think of as slavery and just as exploitative. And like I say, the overall notion of slavery is intensely dehumanizing. But yet there was this wide range of types of slaves. And the odd thing is, in the city of Rome, many of the worst jobs, so if you're, just a laborer hauling crap around, at the docks or, things like that, you might well be a free person and a slave would hold a skilled job. And that seems a little strange or counterintuitive to us, but you see how in the Roman economy it sort of works.
And that could be one of the things that would be surprising to us coming from the modern day to the ancient world is just the number of slaves. So you mentioned one of the things we don't think about is that most of the people are farmers.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is just the number of slaves.
And there's a big debate. How many slaves were there? What percentage of the populace, let's say in the city of Rome, were slaves? And this is something historians like to argue about a lot. And we keep coming back to this theme of, sometimes it's the little things that illustrate stuff well. And for slaves, the one that always gets me is some slaves, and these would be sort of the more abused slaves, they would literally put little bronze collars on them with a tag that said, hi, my name is Felix. I'm the slave of so-and-so. I've run away. If you catch me, return me to the temple of so-and-so and you'll get a reward. So it's a dog tag, right? Except this is a human being. And you can see these in museums. I mean, you can go to a museum today and see this little bronze collar with a tag on it that's talking about a human being as if they're this kind of animal that's run away. And this is very telling too. We're talking about Roman law. Under Roman law, technically, when a slave runs away, the crime that he's committing is theft because he's stolen himself from his master. So again, it's this very dehumanizing view of it.
And just a reminder to people in America thinking about this, we have a certain view and picture to what slavery is. A reminder that all of human history, most of human history has had slaves of all colors, of all religions. That's within us to select a group of people, call them the other, use them as objects, abuse them. And I would say, as a person who believes the line between good and evil runs to the heart of every man, all of us, every person listening to this is capable of being owner of a slave if they're put in the position, of capable of hating the other, of forming the other, of othering other people. And we should be very careful not to look ourselves in the mirror and remind ourselves that we're human. It's easy to kind of think, okay, well, there's these slaves and slave owners through history, and I would have never been one of those. But just like as we would be farmers, we could be both. If we went back into history, we could be both slaves and slave owners, and all of those are humans.
I mean, just to build on that, I'd say the othering of others is a morally corrosive thing to do.
Yeah. So this fascinating transition between the Republic to the Empire. Can we talk about that? Mm-hmm. How does the Republic fall?
Oh boy. Okay, so the Roman Republic, on the one hand, is incredibly successful, right? In a short period of time, it's expanded wildly. It's conquered the Mediterranean world. It's gained tons of wealth. The contradiction here is that Rome's very success has made almost every group within Roman society deeply unhappy and boiling with resentment. So this is the contradiction. Enormous success on the surface, you end up with this boiling pot of resentment and unhappiness. So let's break this down. Who's unhappy? Well, the people fighting Rome's wars. The common farmers who went off to fight. They joined the army, they went and fought, they've come back, they've seen Rome get wealthy, they've seen their generals get wealthy, they've conquered all these areas, all this money and stuff is flowing back to Rome, but when they're discharged from the army, they don't get that much. So they feel like I spent the best years of my life fighting for my country. I deserve a reward. I haven't gotten it. So you have a lot of veterans who are now unemployed or underemployed. Many of them have sold their small family farms when they went off to join the army, and now they don't have them. So that group's unhappy, the veterans. You have the aristocrats, who on the surface, the ones who are doing well, they're the politicians and the generals. But as time goes on, the ones who get the plum appointments, who get the good generalships, starts coming from a smaller and smaller subset of the aristocrats. The Scipios and their friends start to dominate. So you end up where most of the aristocratic class is feeling, hey, I'm left out. I didn't get what I deserved. What about the half citizens and the allies, the Italians, who have fought for Rome, who stayed loyal when Hannibal invaded? They didn't go over to his side. Well, they feel rightfully, we stayed loyal to Rome, we fought for them, we deserve our reward, we should be full citizens. But the Romans are traditional, they're conservative, they don't like change, they don't give them that. What about all the slaves? Well, they've conquered all these foreigners, they've sold them. Now many of them are working these plantations, big plantations owned by rich people that used to be little family farms. The slaves are obviously unhappy. So you end up with a society where it's incredibly successful by about 100 BC, but almost every group that composes it feels like I haven't shared in the benefits of what's happened, or I've been exploited by it. So they all end up intensely unhappy. And the next 100-year period from 133 to 31 BC is called the Late Roman Republic, and it's a time of nearly constant internal strife, ultimately culminating in multiple rounds of civil war. So Roman society literally breaks apart, turns on itself, and goes to war with itself over not equitably sharing the benefits of conquest and of empire. So it's a lesson about not sharing the benefits of something in a society, but concentrating it in one little group. And the other thing that happens is among the aristocrats, they start to get more and more ambitious. So in the past, there was a lot of ideology of the state is more important than the person. If you were a little Roman kid, you would have been told these stories of Roman heroes, and they're all about self-sacrifice, putting the state before you, about modesty, about these sort of, values. Well, by the late Republic, you have a succession of strong men. And it is a chain. So it goes, Marius, Sully, Pompey, Julius Caesar, where each one pushes the boundaries of the Roman Republic a little bit, pushes at the structures of the institutions of the Republic, and they're motivated by personal gain. They're putting themselves above the state. So at the same time, you have lots of groups unhappy in society, and you get these strong men who are now undermining the institutions, chipping away at the things that have been shared, things holding the state together. And in the end, they just become so ambitious. They're like, I don't care about the state. I'm going to try and make myself ruler of Rome. So, I mean, this is going to culminate obviously in Julius Caesar, who does succeed in making himself dictator for life of the Roman Republic, which is tantamount to king, and he gets assassinated for it. But he's the end point of this progression of people who really undermine the institutions of the Republic through their own personal greed.
So the resentment boils and boils and boils, and there's this person that puts themselves
and they exploit it. They're demagogues.
Yeah,
they exploit it.
But Caesar puts himself above the state, and that, I guess, the Roman people also hate.
Well, I mean, it's a love-hate because Caesar is very successful at playing to the Roman people. So he becomes their hero where he says, I'll be your champion against the state who doesn't care about you. So Caesar will do things where he'll put on big shows for the people. And it's cynical. I mean, he's doing this to further his own political power, but he's presenting himself as a populist in essence, even though he aspires to be a dictator, right? But it's a way of winning the people's support because that's a tool for him in his struggle with other aristocrats.
So a dictator in populist clothing.
Yes.
But he gets
when convenient. Other times he'll play to the aristocracy.
And when he gets assassinated, another civil war explodes.
That's an interesting moment because all these things have been leading up to Caesar, and it really is a chain of men. So it starts with this guy, Marius, who was one of the first to start making armies loyal to him rather than to the state. That's a step in the wrong direction, right? The army should be loyal to the state, not to an individual general. They shouldn't look for him to rewards. Marius kind of breaks that, makes a precedent. One of his proteges is a guy named Sulla. Sulla comes along and he ends up marching on Rome with his army and taking it over. And he says, well, I'm just doing it for the good of the state. But that's another precedent. Now you've had someone attacking their own capital city, even if they say they're doing it for the right reasons. Then Pompey comes along, and Pompey just breaks all kinds of things. He starts holding offices when he's too young to do so. He raises personal armies from his own wealth. He disobeys commands. He manipulates commands. He does all kinds of stuff. But in the end, he sides with the Senate when sort of forced. And finally, Caesar comes along, and Caesar's just shamelessly, no, it's about me. I'm going to push it. And he is the one who wins a civil war against the state and Pompey, takes over Rome and says, now I'm going to be dictator. And dictator is a traditional office in the Roman state, but dictators were limited to no more than 6 months in power. And Caesar says, well, I'll be dictator for life, which of course is king. He gets killed for it. So Caesar succeeded in taking over the state as one man, but he couldn't solve the problem. How do you rule Rome as one person and not get killed for looking like a king? Mm-hmm. That's the dilemma, the riddle that Caesar leaves behind him. He did it. He seized power as one guy, but how do you stay alive? How do you come up with something that the people will accept? And Caesar did some other things which were bad. He was arrogant. He didn't even pretend that the Senate were his equals. He just kind of, railroaded them around. He didn't respect them. He named a month after himself, July, Julius. He did egotistical things. So that pissed people off. They didn't like it. And when Caesar dies, it's this interesting moment. The Republic's sort of dead by then. You're gonna have a hard time reviving it. You've broken too many precedents. But there's a power vacuum now. Caesar's gone. What's going to happen next? And you have a whole group of people who want to be the next Caesar. So the most obvious is Mark Antony, who is Caesar's right-hand man, his lieutenant. He's a very good general. He's very charismatic. Everybody kind of expects Mark Antony to just become the next Caesar. But there's also another of Caesar's lieutenants, a guy named Lepidus, sort of like Antony, but not quite as great as him. There's the Senate itself, which wants to reassert its power, kind of become the dominant force in Rome again. There's the assassins who killed Caesar, led by Brutus and another guy, Cassius. They now want to seize control. And finally, there's a really weird dark horse candidate to fill this power vacuum, and that's Julius Caesar's grand nephew, who at the time is a 17-year-old kid named Octavian. Who cares? He's nobody. Absolutely nobody. But when Caesar's will is opened after his death, so posthumously read, in his will, Caesar posthumously, and this is a little weird, posthumously adopts Octavian as his son. Now again, who cares? Antony gets the troops, Antony gets the money, the other people get everything. What does Octavian get? He gets to now rename himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Who cares? Well, around the Mediterranean, there's about 12 legions full of hardened soldiers who are just kind of used to following a guy named Gaius Julius Caesar. And even though it's not quite logical, this 18-year-old, he's now 18-year-old kid, inherits an army overnight. So he becomes a player in this game for power. And the next 30, 40 years is going to be those groups all vying with one another. There's another candidate too, Pompey's son. Pompey was Caesar's great rival. He has a couple sons, and one of them, a guy named Sextus Pompey, basically becomes a warlord who seizes control of Sicily, one of the richest provinces, has a whole navy. He's vying to be one of these successors too. So for the next 40 years, it's, as you said, another civil war to see which guy emerges. Is it going to be the Senate? Is it going to be the assassins? Is it going to be Antony? Is it going to be Lepidus? Is it going to be Sextus Pompey? Is it going to be Octavian?
So now looking back at all that history, it just feels like history turns on so many interesting accidents, because Octavian, later renamed Augustus, turned out to be actually, depends how you define good, but a good king/emperor. different than Caesar in terms of humility, at least being able to play, not to piss off everybody. But like it could have been so many other people. It could that could have been the fall of Rome. It's a fascinating little turn of history. Maybe Caesar saw something in this individual. It's not an accident that he was in the will.
Yeah, I mean, Caesar clearly did see something in him. And Octavian, I mean, to cut to the end, is the one who emerges from all that as the victor. We can talk about how he does it, but he's the one who sort of ends up in the same position as Caesar. It takes him 30 years, but he defeats all the foes. He's the sole guy. He now faces Caesar's riddle. How do you rule Rome as one guy and not get killed? And Octavian's, what makes him stand out, what makes him fascinating to me, is he wasn't a good general. In fact, he was a terrible general. He lost almost every battle he commanded. But what he is he's politically savvy, and he's very good at what today we would call manipulation of your public image and propaganda. So he basically defeats Mark Antony partially by waging a propaganda war against him. I mean, Antony starts out as a legitimate rival, and there are two Romans vying for power. At the end of this war, propaganda war, Octavian has managed to portray Antony as a foreign aggressor allied with an enemy king or queen, in this case Cleopatra, and who is an official enemy of the Roman state. And that's all propaganda. So he takes what's a civil war and makes it look like a war against a foreign enemy. And when Octavian becomes the sole ruler, he looks at what Caesar did wrong and he very carefully avoids the same mistakes. So the first thing is just how he lives his life. He's very modest. He lives in an ordinary house like other aristocrats. He wears just a plain toga, nothing fancy. He's respectful to the Senate. He treats them with respect. He eats simple foods. I mean, he's someone who cared about the reality of power, not the external trappings. Clearly, there's some rulers who love, I want to dress in fancy clothes. I want to be surrounded by gold, everything. This is what makes me feel good. Octavian's the opposite. He doesn't care about any of that. He wants real power. And then the other thing is, how is he going to rule Rome without looking like a king? And his solution to this is brilliant. He basically pretends to resign from all his public offices. And not pretends, he does. So he holds no official office. But what he does is he manipulates so that the Roman Senate votes him the powers of the key Roman offices, but not the office itself. So the highest office in the Roman state is the consul. Consuls have the power to command armies, do all sorts of things, run meetings of the Senate. Octavian gets voted the powers of a consul. So he can command armies, control meetings of the Senate, do all this, but he's not one of the two consuls elected for every year. So he's just kind of floating or drifting off to the side of the Roman government. He gets the power of a tribune, which has all sorts of powers. He can veto anything he wants, but he's not one of the tribunes elected for any 1 year. So the state, the republic, appears to continue as it always has. Each year they hold the same elections, they elect the same number of people. Notionally, those people are in charge. But floating off to the side, you have this guy Octavian, who has equivalent power not just to any one magistrate or official, but to all of them. So at any moment, he can just sort of pop up and say, no, let's not do this. Let's do something else. And he also keeps the army under his personal control.
Isn't this a fascinating story? Like, what do you think is the psychology of Augustus of Octavian?
Yeah, and he later changed his name to Augustus when he sort of becomes the first emperor. And the other thing he does is he hides his power behind all these different names. So, Caesar called himself dictator for life, right? So everybody knew what he was. Octavian, we even have a source that talks about it. He says he wondered what to call himself. Do I call myself king? No, can't do that. Dictator for life? No way. Maybe I'll call myself Romulus. That was the founder of Rome. No, Romulus was a king. And finally, a solution is he takes a bunch of titles, which are all ambiguous, and no one of them sounds that impressive, but collectively they are. So, for example, one of the titles he gets is Augustus, which is something tied to Roman religion. Something that is Augustus in Latin has two possible meanings. One is someone who is Augustus is very pious. They respect the gods deeply. Well, that sounds nice, doesn't it? While on the other hand, an alternative meaning for Augustus is something that is itself divine. So is he just a deeply religious, pious person, or is he himself sacred? There's that ambiguity. He calls himself princeps, which means first citizen. Okay, what the hell does that mean? Am I a citizen just like everybody else? Or am I the first citizen, which means I'm superior to all the others? So every title he takes has this weird ambiguity. He calls himself Imperator, which is traditionally something that soldiers shout at a victorious general who's won a battle. And now he takes this as a permanent title. So it implies he's a good general. And by the way, it's from Imperator that we get the word emperor, and empire. So originally it's a military title, a spontaneous military acclamation.
It's just fascinating that he figured out a way through public image, through branding, to gain power, maintain power, and still pacify the boiling turmoil that led to the civil wars.
Yeah. Well, two things I think work in his favor as well. One is he brings peace and stability. So by this point, the Romans have experienced 100 years almost of civil war and chaos. So at that point, your family, maybe you've had family members die in these wars or been proscribed, your property has been confiscated, who knows what. And here's a guy who brings peace and stability and doesn't seem oppressive or cruel or whatever. So you're like, okay, fine. I don't care. Maybe he's killed the Republic, but at least we're not dying in the streets anymore. So that's a big thing he does. And secondly, even though Augustus always seemed kind of sickly, his constitution, he lives forever. He rules for like 50 years. And by the time he dies, there's no one literally almost left alive who can remember the Republic. So at that point, by the time he dies, this is the only system we know.
That's another just fascinating accident of history, because as we talked about with Alexander the Great, who knows if he lived for another 40 years? If over time the people that hate the new thing die off, and then their sons and come into power, that could be a very different story. Maybe we'll be talking about the Greek
Empire. That's a fluke
Empire.
of fate, but it's hugely influential on history.
You mentioned Cleopatra. If we go back to that, what role did she play? Another fascinating human being.
Cleopatra is interesting. I mean, she was a direct descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy. When Alexander's empire had broken up, Ptolemy, this general, had seized control of Egypt, made it his kingdom. And she, 10 generations later, is a descendant of this Macedonian general. So Egypt had been ruled by, in essence, foreigners, these Macedonian dynasty of kings, and often they literally were ruled by the same dynasty because they had a habit of marrying brothers to sisters. And Cleopatra was, in fact, originally married to her younger brother. But despite that, she seems to have intensely identified with Egypt. In fact, she seems to have been the first one of all these Ptolemy kings who actually bothered to learn to speak Egyptian. So she seemed to really have cared about Egypt as well. And she was clearly very smart, very clever. And so she's living at a time during the late Republic when Rome is having all these civil wars, and Egypt is really the last big independent kingdom left around the shores of the Mediterranean. Everything else has been conquered by Rome. So she is in this very precarious position where clearly she wants to maintain Egyptian independence, but Rome is this juggernaut that's rolling over everything. And she ends up meeting Julius Caesar when Caesar comes to Egypt chasing Pompey, his great rival. After he defeats Pompey, Pompey runs to Egypt thinking he'll find sanctuary there, and the Egyptians kill him and chop off his head. And when Caesar lands, they hand it to him and say, "Here, have a present." And she, of course, famously ends up having a love affair with Caesar. Was that a genuine love, or was she just sort of, using this as a way to try and keep Egypt independent, to give it some status? We don't know. After she does have several kids with Caesar. After Caesar's assassinated and the Roman world is having another civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony. Mark Antony is basing himself in the East. He meets Cleopatra, and he has a big love affair with her. And this one seems pretty genuine. I mean, Antony and Cleopatra, there's a lot of stories about them kind of partying together. They like to sort of cosplay and dress up as different gods. So Cleopatra would dress up as the goddess Isis, and Antony would dress up as the god Dionysus in a leopard skin, and they'd have these big parties and stuff. And they end up together fighting against Octavian. And in the end, they're defeated by Octavian. And Antony commits suicide. Cleopatra, there's differing accounts of her death. She may have also killed herself, or she may actually have been killed by Octavian to just get her out of the way. But she's an interesting figure because she was clearly a very smart woman who managed to keep Egypt alive as an independent state. She seemed to have actually cared about Egypt and identified with it, and succeeded at a time with all these famous people, in being a real kind of mover and shaker and a force in events.
I mean, she's probably one of the most influential women in human history.
She's certainly, again, she's someone that her image is incredibly important.
Yes.
And I mean, one of the interesting things, the whole question of gender in the Roman world. I mean, this gets into Roman sources, but of course, it's a heavily male-dominated history. And I mean, men and women did not have equality in ancient Rome. It's a male-dominated society. It's misogynist in many ways. But what I'm constantly struck by is when you start again delving into the sources, you always hear, okay, well, there was this one woman who was a philosopher, and she's an exception to the rule. And yeah, okay, she's fine. And then you start looking into, and there's also 60 other female philosophers. Well, is that so much an exception anymore? Or, Cleopatra is the one queen. She's this strong queen. And then you look and, well, there was this other queen here. There was this queen here. There was this queen here who led armies. And here's another one who led armies. And again, it's like, well, are they exceptions to the rule, or is just the history that was written, which is written by men, a little bit selective in how it portrays them? Because the sources are all these male elites who have very definite ideas about women. The conventional notion has always been that, business in the Roman Empire was a male field. Well, but then there's this woman, Eumachia in Pompeii, who actually had the largest building in Pompeii right on the Forum named after her with a giant statue of her. And she was a patron to a bunch of the most important guilds in Pompeii. Okay, she's the exception to the rule. Oh, but then there's these other 4 women we have from Pompeii who also were patrons of guilds. And then there's this woman, Plancia Magna, in this other place. And she was the most important patron in the town and put up all these statues. So at some point, when do you start to say, well, maybe women did play more of a role, but they just haven't been recorded in the sources in the way that maybe they deserve to be?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Is it the bias of society, or is it the bias of the historian? The bias of the society that the historian is writing about, or the bias of the actual historian?
And the bias of the historians who have written history up to this point.
Yeah.
I was just writing a lecture which was about this woman, Musa, who is a crazy story. And she ties into Augustus, actually. Augustus, his biggest diplomatic triumph that he boasted about constantly was that about 50 years before him, the Romans had sent an expedition into Parthia, this neighboring kingdom, led by Crassus, and they'd gotten wiped out. So it was this big disaster, military disaster. And the standards of the Roman legions, the eagles that each Roman legion carried, had been captured by the Parthians. And this is the most humiliating thing that can happen to a Roman legion, to have its eagles captured. And Augustus desperately wanted to negotiate with the Parthians to get these eagles returned. Okay, this was his big diplomatic thing. So he was constantly sending these embassies to Parthia. On one of these embassies, he sent along as a gift to the Parthian king a slave woman named Musa. Musa seems to have pleased the king of Parthia because she becomes one of his concubines. And then she gives birth to a son by the king, and eventually she becomes upgraded to the level of wife. And Musa eventually murders the Parthian king, arranges it so that her son becomes the king of Parthia, and she's really ruling the whole empire behind the scenes as his mother. So this is a literal rags to riches story of a slave, someone who starts out a slave and becomes the queen of an empire almost as large and powerful as Rome. Okay? But yet, how often do we hear about Musa? And when you look in traditional histories of Roman-Parthian relations, and I went and looked at this because I was just writing this lecture, most of those histories didn't even mention her. They just talked about her son, like he had just come out of nowhere and become the new heir to the Parthian throne, when it was all her doing, clearly. Now that's selective editing of history by historians to downplay the role that this woman played. And there's a lot of examples like that.
That's fascinating.
She got overthrown after a few years. There was a revolution against her, and we don't know what happened to her then. But she's a really interesting figure. Oh, and by the way, Augustus did negotiate the return of the Parthian standards and got them back. And he was so proud of this that this is what he constantly boasted about. And the most famous statue of Augustus, the Augustus from Prima Porta, which is in the Vatican today, he's wearing a breastplate. And on the breastplate, right in the middle of the stomach, is a Parthian handing over a golden eagle, legionary standard, to a Roman. So this is what Augustus thought of as his greatest achievement. And that embassy that arranged that was the one that sent Musa to Parthia.
So Augustus marks the start of the Roman Empire.
Yep.
You've written that Octavian Augustus would become Rome's first emperor, and the political system that he created would endure for the next half a millennium. This system would become the template for countless later empires up through the present day, and he would become the model emperor against whom all subsequent ones would be measured. The culture and history of the Mediterranean basin, the Western world, and even global history itself were all profoundly shaped and influenced by the actions and legacy of Octavian. He was the founder of the Roman Empire, and we still live today in the world that he created. So what, on the political side of things, and maybe beyond, what is the political system that he created?
Are you dreaming of more freedom, more dough to thrive, and financial options to keep your dreams alive? If you can dream it, then bread provides, yeah. More than a bank, we're here for you all the way. With bread, your best life starts today. Yeah, your money doing so much more. Bread is just the thing that you're looking for. Cause bread loves everyone, and it's the type of journey that should be fun. The life you always wanted, time to make it true, cause you deserve it. And bread is the one for you. Bread Financial, the best thing since online banking.
Well, I mean, I think Octavian / Augustus, it's the same guy, is one of the most influential people in history because he did found the Roman Empire. So he's the one who oversaw this transition from republic to empire, and he sets the template which every future emperor follows. Mm-hmm. So just in the most obvious way, for the next either 500 or 1500 years, depending how long you think the Roman Empire lasted for, everyone is trying to be Augustus. They all take on the same titles. Every Roman emperor after him is Caesar Augustus, Imperator, Pater Patrae, all these titles he has, they take too. And so he's hugely influential for Western civilization, all this. But beyond just that literal thing, which is already 500 years, 1500 years, he becomes the paradigm of the good ruler. Mm-hmm. So of an absolute ruler who is nevertheless sort of just, does good things, builds public works, is popular. So if we jump ahead, let's say, to the Middle Ages, the most significant ruler of the early Middle Ages is Charlemagne, right? He's the guy who unites most of Europe. He becomes the paradigm for all medieval kings after him. Well, what is the title that the Pope gives to Charlemagne? Because there's this famous moment when the Pope acknowledges Charlemagne as the preeminent European king and crowns him on Christmas Day of the year 800. And the title that the Pope gives to Charlemagne is Charles, that's Charlemagne, Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. He's giving him the title of Augustus because that's the nicest thing he can think of to say to Charlemagne is to say, you're the new Augustus, you're Emperor of the Romans.
Yeah.
So that image is hugely powerful. And that persists on and on. I mean, even the literal names of most rulers afterwards come from this. In Russia, the czars are Caesars. That's where czar comes from. Mm-hmm. Prince comes from princeps, first citizen, one of the titles. Emperor comes from imperator, one of the titles of Augustus. When Napoleon becomes emperor, what does he call himself? First consul, which is kind of like princeps. And then he calls himself emperor. I mean, everybody wants to be this kind of ruler. So he's the paradigm of this for the rest of history. And you can see that as both a positive and a negative legacy. It's kind of like Alexander. I mean, everybody wants to be the next Alexander. Now, nobody does become the next Alexander. Nobody's as successful as him, but a lot of people try. And you can see that either as, oh, inspirational or awful, because lots of people killed lots of other people and started lots of wars trying to be the next Alexander. At least Augustus has this notion of good rulership, that you're not just a great powerful person, but you're a good ruler somehow.
Can you speak to the kind of political system he created? So, how did he consolidate power, as you spoke to a bit already, and what role did the Senate now play? How were the laws? Who was the executive? How was power allocated, and so on?
Yeah, so once the empire begins, let's say 27 BC, so in 31 BC, Octavian defeats Antony at the Battle of Actium. So that's kind of the moment he becomes the sole ruler. And then in 27 BC, a couple of years later, he settles the Roman Republic, is how it's referred to, which basically sets up his system. And in this system, on the surface, it all looks the same. You still have a Senate. Each year, there's elections. All the Roman citizens vote. They elect magistrates who notionally are in charge of Rome. But as I mentioned, off to the side, you now have this figure of Augustus who sort of controls everything behind the scenes. And that continues. So this political system he establishes continues. And in reality, I would say Augustus at that point is again a king. It really is one man controlling the state, even if notionally it's still continuing as a republic. They are electing magistrates, but the magistrates only do what the emperor tells them, right? But it's this sort of formal versus informal power. The formal structure is a republic. The way things really work informally is it's a monarchy. Now, if you asked Augustus, what did he do? Did you become a king? He said, and he says this explicitly, no, no, no. What I did is I refounded the Roman Republic. That's how he phrases it.
Damn, this guy is good at framing.
He's so good at propaganda. I'll give you one more example that I love. Augustus actually writes his own autobiography, which is very rare and survives. So here we have the autobiography of one of the pivotal figures in history. And if you had conquered the world, let's say, starting at the age of 18, what would you call your autobiography? It'd be something like, How I Conquered the World, right? Augustus calls his the Res Gestae, which the best sort of literal translation is Stuff I Did. I mean, it's the most modest title for someone who could have given the most grandiose title. And the first line of it is, at the age of 18, when the liberty of the republic was oppressed by a faction, I defended it. Now, the way I might phrase that sentence is, at the age of 18, I fought a civil war against another Roman and conquered the Roman state. But no, he defended the liberty of the republic when it was oppressed by the tyranny of a faction. That's propaganda. And it works.
It is propaganda, but is there a degree to which he also lived it? That kind of humility, establishing that humility is the standard of the way government operates. So it's not like a literal direct balance of power, but it's sort of a cultural balance of power where the emperor is not supposed to be a bully and a dictator.
I would really like to know what Romans of his time thought. Like if you were alive at that moment, would you honestly believe, oh, okay, we've got this guy Augustus, but he's brought peace. He's just kind of keeping in charge for a while till things settle down. We've just had 100 years of civil war. I think we still have a republic. Or would you say, nah, we have a king now? And I don't know what the answer to that is. I will tell you that it takes 200 years before we have the first Roman source that bluntly calls Augustus a king. So 200 years. It takes the Romans 200 years to admit to themselves. And that's a guy who comes along 200 years later and says, hey, Augustus, he looks like a king. He acts like a king. Let's just call him a king, because he had every aspect of a king except the paltry title.
Maybe I'm buying his propaganda and maybe I'm a sucker for humility, but I suspect that the Romans bought it. And I also suspect he himself believed it. I mean, there is such thing as good kings, right? There's kings that understand the downside, the dark side of
Yeah.
absolute power, and can wield that power properly.
And
right?
and you know, to give sort of both sides here, Augustus wasn't all nice. I mean, there were moments where he was extremely cruel. So early in his career, when he's still fighting, when he's for power, he goes all in on prescriptions, which is where he and Antony and other people basically post lists of their enemies and say it's legal for anyone to kill these people. And so hundreds are massacred there, including Cicero, the great orator, is prescribed and killed. There's moments when he's really cruel. One slave once gets him angry and he has him tortured in a particularly sort of cruel manner. So, I mean, on the one hand, he had this clemency. On the other hand, he could be really hard-nosed and hard-edged. And I think he was a very calculating person.
Yeah. So the thing I would love to know is what he was actually like behind the mask.
Yes. I mean, that to me is one of those, like, if you could invite a historical person to dinner or whatever, I want to know what the real Augustus was, what he really thought he was doing, because he's an enigma. And he has this great moment when he dies, right? What's his dying lines on his deathbed? He says, "If I've played my part well, dismiss me from the stage with applause." So he's seeing himself as an actor, that his whole life was acting this role, which is, again, all that manipulation and public image. He was brilliant at that. But who's the real guy? What was behind that image?
And by the way, as long as we're talking about brutality, I think you mentioned in a few places that there's a lot of brutality going on at the time. With Caesar just killing very large numbers of people brutally.
I mean, Caesar, his campaigns in Gaul are interesting because for a long time they were held up as, oh, genius general, look at the amazing things he did. But another way to view it is he provoked, and he truly provoked, a war with people who were not that interested in fighting Rome and just repeatedly attacked different tribes for the sole purpose of building up his career, his prestige, his status, gaining territory, making himself wealthier. And he basically conquers all of modern France and Belgium and some of Switzerland. So this is, a big chunk of Europe gets conquered, hundreds of thousands of people killed, hundreds of thousands of people enslaved to further one guy's career. I mean, if you wanted, could call Caesar a war criminal. And I think that wouldn't be unfair. But on the other hand, some people see him as a great hero. I mean, to talk about history and its reception, it's quite interesting to see how Caesar has been viewed by different generations. So at different points in time, the sort of, received wisdom on Caesar is very different. So back in the, let's say the 1920s or 30s, there were a number of scholarly things written which kind of looked at Caesar as an admirable figure. He's a strong man who knows what Rome needed and, was going to give it to them. And of course, that's the era when fascism was kind of trendy and was seen as a positive thing. And then you get, Hitler in World War II, and all of a sudden fascism's not so favored anymore. And then in that post-war generation, all of a sudden Caesar's terrible. He's a dictator. He's destroying the republic. So often histories that are written tell you a lot more about the time they're written than they do about the subject they're written about.
Do we know, what did Hitler or Stalin think about the Roman Empire?
I mean, certainly they borrow a lot of the trappings. I mean, Nazi Germany borrows a lot of iconography from ancient Rome. They carried around little military standards with eagles on them, just like the Romans. But then everybody does that. I mean, the U.S. has eagles as their standards. Mussolini had them. Napoleon had eagle standards for his, military. So a lot of people like that imagery.
You mentioned Cicero. He's a fascinating figure. On the topic of Roman oratory, who was Cicero?
Cicero was a new man, so he's someone who didn't have famous ancestors. So he was at a disadvantage. And I think Cicero is really interesting for a couple reasons. One is he wrote an incredible amount. I think we have almost more words from Cicero than any other author that survive. And it's all kinds of stuff. It's philosophical treatises. It's books about how to be a good public speaker. He published, volume after volume of his personal letters to his friends. He published these things. So there's tons of stuff from him. And secondly, he's interesting because he lived at this incredibly important time in the late Republic when things were falling apart. but he seems to have been born with none of the natural advantages that all these other people had. So he was a lousy general. He didn't come from a wealthy family. He didn't come from a famous aristocratic family. He didn't have a lot of these advantages, but yet he ended up being right at the center of things, rose to the highest elected office in the Roman state on the basis of one skill, and that was his ability with words, his ability to get up in front of a crowd and persuade them of what he wanted them to believe. And oratory, public speaking, was absolutely central to life at Rome. There were just all these events where people had to get up and give speeches. So in courtrooms, at funerals, in the Senate, to the people of Rome, at games. I mean, just constantly there were these opportunities for giving speeches. So if you were good at this, that was a huge advantage in your political career. And Cicero was the best. He was arguably the best public speaker of all time, some people claim. And he lived right in this era, and he parlayed that skill with words into this very successful political career. He was one of the guys involved with all this stuff with Caesar and Pompey and all the other things going on, Octavian, Mark Antony.
And you've written, which is fascinating. It's fascinating when the echoes of people from a distant past are seen today. The same stuff is seen today, not just like some of the beautiful legal stuff that we've been talking about, but the tricks, let's say the shitty stuff we see in politics. So many of the rhetorical tricks you wrote, such as mudslinging, exaggeration, guilt by association, ad hominem attacks, name calling, fear mongering, us versus them, rhyme, and so on and so forth.
Well,
so I'm guessing it worked, given that we still have those today.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Cicero did is he wrote at least 3 of these sort of handbooks about how to be a good public speaker. Mm-hmm. So we know a lot about that. We have his own speeches that survive, and then we have later people after Cicero who wrote about what Cicero did too. So we know a lot about what he did. And the key to Cicero